The Elbaph flashback is over. Prince Loki is finally free, and given what we now know about his devil fruit, Mr. Emu is now more vulnerable than ever. Very interesting stuff. However, this chapter, it begins in a rather somber place. We pick up in what remains of Orest Castle with this just sea of giant bodies, and everything is, well, it's eerily still and quiet. When just moments ago, this battleground was used to determine the fate of the world as we know it. Everyone present here knew that if Harold was allowed to leave this castle, then it was going to be an apocalyptic level event. And so there's this sense of profound relief that Harold was stopped, but also extreme tragedy, and in the case of Shanks, extreme anger. I don't think we've ever seen Shanks this angry before. He's furious, and he's even doing, the Nami thing of grabbing his tattoo. No doubt wanting to do anything he can to rip it off. And yet, there is no Lord of the Coast in sight for him to do so. And Scopocaban does step in to play dad again, but Shanks is blaming himself for Harold's death and saying, oh, if only I, Shanks, had acted sooner. And I do kind of agree with this, because he did arrive on Elbaph and spend a lot of time in the bath instead of, carrying out his purpose. But in defense of his cleanliness, Harold was already under the Depths Covenant by then, so he was already too late. And this does seem to be a very formative moment for Shanks. And we even have a flashback of Garling, a memory which Shanks despises, although I will say, kind of in Garling's defense, he is a horrible man from a horrible culture, but he does seem strangely, genuinely supportive of his son. And it reminds me of how much St. Rosward was concerned for his son, St. Charlos. And so it keeps weirding me out that some of the more caring fathers in the series are actually world nobles. It's very strange. But in this aftermath, there's an extremely sad panel where we see the remnants of Harold's body, or we see the legs, a colossal pool of dark bloods. But Loki has taken off his cloak and covered his father with as much of it as possible as a sign of respect, which is a gesture that you may recognize because this is the same position that the fight between Luffy and Katakuri ended up in. Katakuri, to his credit, was a lot less dead, but he was on his back, legs a-spreadin', and having a good old starfish after a very long fight. And what Luffy did was remove his formal hat and he placed it on Katakuri's mouth to cover him up as a sign of respect. So this is a far more tragic version of that. It's another nice similarity between Luffy and Loki though, considering that they're currently kind of narratively competing with each other via fate to see who gets to be the sun god. But of course, Loki is in tears and questioning, why is this the outcome of loving your country? All father ever wanted to do was build some nice buildings and teach the children how to read an alphabet. Is that really so much to ask? Yes it is. And you should be ashamed for asking. But this flashback then cuts to Marichois, of all places. And this is definitely the most fascinating section of the chapter, where we cut to Emu and the Five Elders following Harold's death, and there's been a bit of an impact. And Emu, he's not taking this very well. No. He's not quite as shook as when he felt Joy Boy's haki from that rope one time. But what I do like is the little detail of his speech bubbles being a bit jagged at first, indicating that Emu, he's being quite sharp and curt here, assumedly because of what he says next. Because this is the first potential weakness of Emu that we've been able to identify, which is that his covenants, well, they come at a cost. To both parties involved, actually. If you're going for a Depths and probably Abyssal Covenant, then that cost is your freedom, but these contracts do seem to demand something of Emu as well. And Marcus Mars suggested that they should send, some more dudes to check out what happened on Elbaph, which is an idea that Emu rejects outright, because he knows that that would just result in the deaths of more holy knights. Emu's been a very questionable character so far in terms of, plottings and plannings, but he does at least have the good sense to recognize that Harold was by far their most powerful fighter, and if he can be killed, then everyone else is going to be killed as well. What are we going to do? Send in Saint Summers? Nah, mate. And this would go on to explain why Elbaph has been left alone from this moment all the way up to when Shamrock and Gunko appeared in the modern day. The Holy Knights could have traveled through the Abyss portal that Harold made at any time, but Emu seems to have been so perpetually terrified of having them do so, because he has no idea what lurks on the island of Elbaph with a mysterious power to kill a Covenant-infected individual, which is a little bit heartbreaking, because it does mean that Harold's sacrifice and Loki killing his father is what is responsible for the island being left alone until now. It's almost as if shattering Harold cast a spell of protection. But this does give us an opening for Emu, and dare I even propose some sort of Harry Potter theory as to why Emu requires these covenants that could perhaps function function in a similar manner to Horcruxes, not necessarily the same at all, but they do seem like a vulnerability. And I wonder what would happen if suddenly every Depths and Abyssal Covenant recipient were to die. Would that result in the death of Emu? Is he directly tied to these individuals at any given point? Or would that be the stage where Emu becomes mortal again and thus very, very smackable? So smackable. But Emu then, he then gives Harold something of a eulogy, a not very nice one. At the very least, it's a strict pondering on this man's existence. Emu brings up Harold's ancient giant blood and the idea that they are incompatible with Emu's vision for the world. And this situation has taught Emu that if he makes the mistake of bringing the wrong person into a covenant, then even if that person is to forfeit their will, it could destroy everything he's built. It could bring down the world government. And again, that would explain some of the hesitance in acting on Elbaph, despite having a clear backdoor onto the island at any given time. But let's say that Emu did rush in there. He immediately reversied a bunch of giants carelessly, and those giants, they end up being a problem for him, even under his control, due to their innate nature. That's Emu's argument anyway, and I think I do buy it, because the exact same thing happened with Bartholomew Kuma on Egghead Island. Saint Saturn thought that he had complete control of him, but Kuma's innate nature said, nah mate, and ruined all of his old man plans. Although I am fully aware that Emu has now gone and done the exact thing that I just said, however, he is in a slightly more desperate situation in the modern day, with the Holy Land burning and everything. He seems to have a problem that only an army of giants can solve, and also having specifically lingered on the ancient giant blood, I should say that Emu's conversions so far all seem to have been giants without physical trace of the ancient giant lineage like Dory and Broggy. The question I still have though is, why is there even a world government presence on Elbaph right now, even before the burning? What changed to push them to arrive at the same fateful time as the Straw Hats? Well, one theory is currently that the man we now suspect to be Shamrock, visiting the Five Elders to talk about a certain pirate in chapter 907, well, that certain pirate may actually be referring to Loki, and that this is Shamrock proposing that they travel to Elbaph in order to recruit him as a holy knight, which they did indeed try to do. And another idea being that their presence here is an edict of Figurland Garling, and one of his first official acts as an Elder Star, to lobby to break the Elbaph travel ban. But I suppose the craziest line in this entire section, and this entire chapter, maybe even this entire arc, is that Emu refers to all of Elbaph as D, or as a D. I don't know, we need to wait for the official. All I really know is that Emu, he does not want the D. And for such an important line, it's quite frustratingly vague, almost as if Emu just chooses to slander all of his direct enemies as filthy Ds. But it is looking more and more likely that the D might not be as simple as just a family name, and it could instead be a title or designation of anyone who joined forces with Joy Boy during the Void Century. Hence why we have Nefertari D Vivi and Nefertari D Cobra now, because Nefertari D Lily aligned herself with Joy Boy and thus kept that designation. And this does remind me of something that happened in chapter 1085, which is the chapter where Cobra dies actually, but we have a short Sabo flashback where he asks why both Luffy and Ace have a D in their name. And Ace then offers the D to Sabo, with Luffy deciding to rename him as Sardebo. And it really could be as easy as that. This stupid little fun scene of the kids could be the biggest hint we have as to how the Will of D came about, and how one goes on to become a D. Sabo became a brother and a supporter of those carrying the Will of D, and so he became something of a defender himself, and was granted a D as a result. Very, very interesting. But then we are back to Loki, and this is the end of the Elbaph flashback. Very surprising. We'll get back to my utter shock in a little bit. Firstly, important thing though, which is that we now have confirmation that it was Loki's will not to follow his father's will, and he refused to tell the truth about Harold, which is a decision that everyone involved in this incident decided to respect, including Jarl, Skopegaban, and Shanks. But I am a bit in shock of just how abruptly this flashback ended. I was definitely not expecting to go back into the modern day during this chapter, which I will say is great. I love seeing our actual main characters again, but there is a lot that's been left curiously unsaid and unshown. As we are told this story, Loki sets out to sea after the Herald incident, and then we're cutting back to the modern day, leaving out a solid 14 years of Loki's life, or maybe not 14, at least 8 years, because he spent the last 6 years chained to the tree. But we don't get to see anything that he did in the outside world, which was the stuff that I was really looking forward to, actually. I wanted to know exactly which familiar characters Loki may have come across and what it is he was even trying to accomplish. Of course, I was also expecting to see him propose to Lola, and even bigger than that, his fight with Shanks, the event that likely turned Shanks into one of the 4 emperors, as eventually it had to fall to him to step up and halt Loki's rampage. And what I want to believe, this could be cope, but what I want to believe is that we're just stopping here for the moment, because we did the dramatic stuff, oh, the sad, the tears, the Harold, he's dead, and now it is time to pay some of that off with some good old punching. And that later on we'll return to the huge missing portion of Loki's history, but I also don't necessarily know about that. In late One Piece, as wonderfully detailed as this, the longest flashback in One Piece history, has been, Oda still does have a tendency to skip quite a bit and streamline character histories down to their most integral beats, and my fear is that we will learn the rest of Loki's history in an SBS, which I don't want. I want to see it. I do get it though. You've only got so many pages per chapter and only so many chapters per year and only so many years per life. But mate, if you are going to have the audacity to create a character as amazing as Loki, then I am going to want to see everything I possibly can with him. However, for a bit more hope, one reason I can see why Oda may be waiting to show us all of the stuff, including the fight with Shanks, is because he still has not officially revealed Loki's devil fruit to us. So perhaps that's what's stopping us fully exploring the rest of Loki's past for now. Because he did clearly leave thinking that his new devil fruit would allow him to take on the world government and potentially even, destroy the world, the Emu. And I really, really want to see how that played out for him. Probably not well. In fact, we know it wasn't well, but I still want to see it. But with that, we are back in the modern day and Harudin makes the decision to free Loki. And this is extremely exciting because this is our first chapter of the year, not officially, but we have just cleared our first 2026 bingo square. Our center square has been greened as Loki is finally completely free and ready to solidify himself as what I think he's going to become a top 20, perhaps even top 10 One Piece character when he gets to go all out against the nightmare creatures, the Holy Knights, and even Emu. It's important to note that Harudin, understanding this and deciding to free Loki, is still quite conflicted though, because Loki has gone and done a whole lot of other bad things. But this right here, this is such an exciting moment. This is the turn. We are officially done with the depressing pit of this arc, and we've just entered a tonal switch, which is symbolized by the Draugr falling into the underworld. That Draugr is saying, "You've been talking too long, fight a skeleton," which means that we are heading into the action-packed climax. And we begin this with a fantastic, phenomenal, amazing demonstration of Loki's unbridled powers against the Draugr. And mate, I just need to say that I never thought that the Draugr was this big when I saw it in all the other panels, remembering that this teeny tiny Loki right here is the size of oars. So this Draugr, oh, it is big. Not that it matters at all though, because Loki, he just takes up Ragnir and he smacks it with an attack named Niflheim, which refers to a primordial realm of Norse mythology. In fact, Niflheim was in the second Thor movie, which used to be referred to as the really bad one. But now Love and Thunder has made that distinction much more difficult to make. But Niflheim is a world of freezing cold, hence Loki's attack freezing the Draugr. And keen Norse appreciators can and will correct me in the comments below, but I do believe that Niflheim is strongly associated with the Nidhogg, a kind of dragon that is currently #1 on the list of suspects to be Loki's devil fruit ability. In this chapter, Loki does also say that he can fly, and dragons, they're usually pretty good at doing that. Usually, Momonosuke wasn't, but everything checks out for now. I do hesitate though, because even though we are so far removed from Wano at this point, deep down, I'm still feeling a bit of dragon fatigue from all of the Kaido and the Momonosuke, and I would really, really love for Loki's devil fruit to be a mythical creature that wasn't a dragon. Although dragons, they are generally tied to the very deep lore of One Piece, not just your Kaidos and your Momonosukes, but also the celestial celestial dragons and Luffy's father dragon. It's just what they is. And I'm sure that it will look amazing. I'm just much less excited to see another mythical dragon Zoan than literally anything else. What I do love, however, is Loki using an ability named after an entire realm. And it makes me wonder if Loki has a whole range of attacks based on each of the 9 realms of Yggdrasil, which would also include the opposite of Niflheim, Muspelheim, which is all about scary fires. And we've already seen Loki use a lightning-based attack, so I don't know, does he have access to every major elemental force of the 9 realms? And I guess I'll just say this right here and now in case it wasn't obvious. This may be the most crazy, overpowered devil fruit in the series to date. Remembering that this was the power that allowed Loki to seemingly very easily defeat Harold, a man whose physical power was on par with Rocksteady Zebek, and following his Emu infusion of even greater powers. I mean, it's a couple of things. It's the fruit combined with Loki and combined with Ragnir, but still, prepare for complete and utter world-breaking madness, because we are about to see why this devil fruit was so essential to Rox's plans, beyond having the ability to actually kill Holy Knights. And I'm very excited for this, but the person who is most excited isn't me, nor is it you. It's actually Luffy, who was overjoyed when Loki was officially freed. Luffy, the only character who has been constantly in Loki's corner even before Luffy knew anything about him. And I've got to say this, it is great to see the main character of the series again. We've gone almost 6 whole months without him, but at the moment, Luffy doesn't feel like the main character, Loki does. Because Luffy is obsessed with Loki. Luffy's almost relegated himself to being a side character in order to give Loki the stage, because he wants to see the things he does. And I can't quite remember the last time that Luffy was this fixated on someone. I'm not sure that it's ever happened at all post-time skip. The way that Luffy is invested in Loki most reminds me of when Luffy first met Chopper on Drum Island. The second that Luffy saw Chopper, it was the adventure equivalent of love at first sight, and Luffy immediately resolved to have Chopper join the crew. And ever since Elbaph started, Luffy has rarely had a single non-Loki related thought. And that does make me feel like there's a decent chance that Luffy is gunning to have Loki join the Straw Hats. His first offer was rejected, it's also not needed anymore, but that doesn't mean that Luffy's not going to keep trying. And this doesn't mean that Loki will join even if Luffy wants him to, but Luffy, he's giving him those Nakama eyes, and I have to take that seriously. And from here, we are now finally, oh, this is so exciting, we are heading back up to the Sun World. We have the monster trio and the just monster that is Loki arriving shortly, and Emu is going to come face to face with 2 of his greatest fears. The inheritor of Joy Boy's will, the sun god Nika, and alongside him, the man who possesses the power to kill his covenant beings. And I don't know where exactly this goes from here, but we are heading into an explosive boss battle, quite possibly the literally biggest that we have ever seen in the entire series, and I cannot wait to see what the rest of 2026 brings us. And you let me know what you thought of the chapter in the comments below. Oda planting the seed of the giant straw hat comes full circle with Elbaph of the D. That's right, never forget, Elbaph loves the D. Which certainly takes us all the way back to chapter 906, which gave us one of the biggest enduring mysteries to this day, which is the giant straw hat that Emu had locked in his freezing vault. What happened is that Emu was seen holding Luffy's bounty, and it looks as if he was, checking to see if it matched the straw hat in his possession. And it appears to be after this point that Emu and the elders put things together, as they started focusing on Luffy and even attempted to use CP0 to assassinate him on Wano, which of course is what ends up triggering Luffy's Devil Fruit Awakening and sending the world government to sleep with their worst nightmares. Now, Emu, he is very small, so the perspective on just how big this straw hat is often been quite difficult to grasp, and we won't know for sure until we see its ancient owner wearing it. But one of the most prominent theories is that this straw hat belonged to Joy Boy, and the Joy Boy himself was a giant from Elbaph. However, that idea does appear to be a lot less sound, after we did see the silhouette of Joy Boy and Emmett interacting in chapter 1122, where Joy Boy appears to be much more regular human-sized, and implying that the straw hat that he was wearing on that head there is the same one that sits on Luffy's head today. Or at least that's definitely what one of the anime openings implied, because we see the hat transition from Joy Boy to Luffy's possession. Here is the thing about Elbaph though. At the moment, this is not an arc that Joy Boy has any presence in. He's tangentially related to it, but only through Nika. We've not spoken the words Joy Boy. The sun god Nika is the figure who's important to Elbaph Latvian history and culture, not Joy Boy. And so that's gotten me thinking, what if the hat that Emu has goes even deeper into the history of this world than Joy Boy does? And what if this giant hat belonged to the original Nika, who may have been a giant and therefore why Nika made his way into the Elbaph pantheon? And if so, really the start of all of Emu's problems would be rooted in Elbaph, which is an impression I do get from Emu's Harold monologue. He states that the world government and the giants were always going to be incompatible with one another, and that even though Harold was an aberration and a perfect candidate to join them, the fact of his origins always would have made sure that this ended poorly. Almost as if Elbaph is the natural enemy of the world government, which I suppose checks out because those with the will of D are said to be the enemies of the gods. And what this tells us is that even though we've only just gotten through the longest flashback in One Piece history, we are nowhere near done with Elbaph. It might not be shown to us in the actual Elbaph arc itself, but there is a very special ancient history of this island that is integral to our understanding of the world. And even once we leave, we will be back to explore that history in a future flashback in the past. Man on the internet, if Emu was hurt by Harold's death because of the Covenant Pact, does that mean he just released Saturn from the pact? And so Saturn died without hurting Emu? That could be it. Whatever the cost of the Covenant is, perhaps that cost is refundable if Emu voluntarily revokes the Covenant. However, if you purchase something from a store and then get buyer's remorse because you made a stupid choice, but then you return to find that the store has been closed down, well then you've completely lost everything you gave to buy it. And Harold, he strikes me as a very expensive purchase. Giant kings, they are quite the luxury item. And now that we are starting to attain some balanced aspects of Emu's powers, surely some people are just going to be more expensive than others. And so the cost to form a covenant with a king of Elbaph may have been quite a substantive investment. And so Harold's death could have significantly harmed Emu and even leave him slightly more vulnerable in the modern day. Having lost that, well, whatever it cost him to give Harold a go. And hence why he's been so conservative with deploying his other holy knights. Although this does lead us to a slightly morbid situation though, something a little bit unusual for One Piece, which is the idea that now all of the holy knights need to be killed if we are going to get rid of Emu. And look, I know that no one's going to be crying for any of them, or most of them. They're not very good people, maybe minus the unique circumstances of Gunko, but even with the very worst of the worst, killing just isn't what our good pirate people really do, not on purpose anyway. So maybe that's why Dragon and the Revolutionary Army are being set up to go against the Holy Knights, because that does seem like a much more comfortable job for them. Although knowing Oda, if we do find a way to banish Emu's presence from Gunko, then that might be the widespread solution used against all of the others as well. But back to the Covenant, it's also possible that Emu was just so he had the shits with Saint Saturn that he just decided to tank the loss. Emu didn't get anything back. He was just so sick of J. Garcia Saturn that he was willing to part with his investment to sever the relationship. Man on the internet, what do you think happened with the soldiers Loki took with him? Maybe they were also seen as traitor? Yes, Loki took the remaining soldiers out to sea with him. I guess they may have become his pirate crew, which is very cool. Loki essentially forming a new giant warrior pirates crew just like Haradin did. Although I don't think that anyone on Elbaph ever knew about these surviving soldiers, because the story that we've been told is that they were all killed. And as another commenter mentioned in response to this, that might be why nobody has ever gone into Oris Castle to bury the bodies, because anyone who does will perform some simple maths, which will reveal that there's quite a few bodies missing. And that's going to lead to questions which have awkward answers. So rather than becoming Loki's crew, these soldiers may have been deposited somewhere else to start a new life for the sake of keeping secrets, and thus ensuring that they would never be in the news alongside Loki. But you know what this means, right? Provided that they weren't all killed at some stage during Loki's global rampage, it means that there is a small army of giants waiting in the world for the right moment to reappear. And as much as I left the chapter review strongly feeling the case for Loki for Nakama, he probably has these dudes somewhere, very loyal dudes who know the exact truth of what Loki did that day. And as soon as Loki puts out the call, bam, we are gonna have a whole third crew of giant warrior pirates to contend with. We have the originals led by Dory and Broggy, the new giant giant warrior pirates led by Haradin, who are also part of the Straw Hat Grand Fleet, and now, very possibly, the Loki pirates, or I don't know, some better name. Just waiting for One Piece film Purple to learn about Loki sea eventers. Can certainly tell that you don't have the will of D, but look, One Piece film Purple, I love that. I love so much of that, because I think you could make such amazing One Piece movies about stories of side characters that Oda, he just admits he doesn't have the time for. Ace would be a very easy one because he already has 2 whole novels of backstory to adapt, but Trafalgar Law, also a great choice. He has a whole novel as well. And Eustace Kid, he has a detailed backstory that was revealed in an SBS that could really use some fleshing out. Or even focused origin stories of One Piece villains, like say you do Katakuri in One Piece film Donut. There is so much potential for One Piece media that I don't think will ever be fully explored, because in order to sell the tickets to the widest audience possible, they always need to be focusing on Luffy and the Straw Hats, which is a shame because it is such a big world. Loki made Luffy pay attention to one of the longest flashbacks in One Piece history. Alright, you say pay attention. I say more likely pretending to pay attention. It's not as if any possible context was going to change Luffy's mind about Loki, although it really does depend on how much of the story that we as readers saw was actually told. Because I could see Luffy becoming extremely interested whenever Shanks comes up, which is quite a bit in Loki's retelling of the day that Harold died. And one question we could ask now is, does Luffy know about Rocksteady Zebek? Because we know about him, but did Loki actually mention Rocks ever, or was all of that story just for our benefit? Although even if Luffy heard 100% of everything we saw, that doesn't mean he's comprehended any of it. And if Rocks ever does come up in discussion again, he'll say something like, oh, that sounds familiar, but also, I don't care. What was that guy's name again? Cox in the bed? Wow, Blackbeard, you're related to Cockman? That sort of thing isn't outside of Oda's realm of possibilities to do. In fact, Oda inserts all sorts of weird sexual innuendo that we don't even notice in English. He's a very sneaky man. I've mentioned this one before, but the name of the devil fruit that Biblo the Owl ate is the Iku-Iku no Mi, with Iku-Iku being the Japanese slang for I'm coming. However, recently Ragnir also follows this innuendo trend as well, because Ragnir's squeaky noise is the word for chestnut, and when you combine the words chestnut and squirrel, it becomes a word that sounds suspiciously like kuritorisu. So there Oda's popping in a clit reference, and people still don't believe me when I say that this man is a proud pervert. He does this all the time, we just don't notice unless it's in the artwork. So the reason Loki has the ability to free the Galilard giants is due to his elemental abilities? I wonder if the previous user froze them and now Loki can undo it. Alright, this is the best thing I've heard all day. Not a lot of people think about this. The ancient Galilard giants on Punk Hazard are frozen, and that doesn't usually lead to a lot of questioning, because half of Punk Hazard itself is frozen, the half where the ancient giants are, to be precise. However, Punk Hazard has only been half frozen for 2 years. It was the battleground that hosted Kuzan versus Sakazuki, and that's what led to the climate of this island permanently changing, whereas before that, Punk Hazard used to be this quite nice, lovely tropical island. And so the Galilard giants would have been frozen centuries and centuries ago under quite wonderful conditions. So what managed to freeze them? And sure, maybe it was a previous user of Loki's Devil Fruit or a previous user of Ragnir or a combination of both. We don't quite have the breakdown of how these powers interact with each other yet and what belongs to who. But if that is the case, then it could work similarly to the petrification abilities of Boa Hancock's Devil Fruit. Although that would actually be quite bad news because according to Boa Hancock, a new user of the fruit cannot undo petrifications of the previous user. But that's just that fruit. If the giants were frozen with some sort of special Niflheim ice, just like the Draugr was in this chapter, then it could be a very unique sort of brand of otherworldly ice. Something that the mortal world doesn't have the abilities to deal with. And in that case, perhaps the only thing that can unfreeze them is this devil fruit or this Ragnir or both. And so that is yet another reason why Rock said that he needed Harold and he needed this fruit. He needed them together at last on his side. So was Gaban just lying when he was telling Luffy about Loki? Because he literally saw the whole thing. Either Oda retconned his involvement, old age is catching up to him, or he's stupid. Alright, so I think this is referring to Gaban initially stopping Luffy from taking the key to release Loki. It's definitely not stupid, and it's not a lie either. What he says is, here's something no burglar would care to take. In other words, releasing Loki is something even the wicked would not dare do. But the reason why Scopogaban was forcing a fight with Luffy was to confirm who and what he is, because he immediately yields after he sees Luffy activating Gear 5th, and Gaban thinks to himself, indeed, all in white, and Gaban then gives Luffy the key without any further mention of Loki. So it was never about Loki. In fact, Gaban gave up the key willingly, knowing that Loki was a pretty good dude anyway, and that probably nothing bad's gonna happen. And he told the truth the whole time. No burglar wanted Loki's key, and freeing him was something that not even the wicked would dare do, because the burglars and the wickeds, they believed in the lie. And in the end, this was all a test. We even see a brief flashback of Shanks telling Scopogaban about Luffy, and Gaban is initially quite old man grumpy and very untrusting of this Luffy, which is why Shanks tells Gaban, quote, "Do as you will with him." Which is interesting in its own right, because it hints that Shanks knew that Luffy was coming to Elbaph, which was never guaranteed. Were it not for the Egghead incident, we would not have been heading there. So Shanks here was using his extremely story-accurate future sight to warn Gaban while he was briefly on the island about Luffy's incoming presence. Sanji carrying a wounded old man again. Gaban is going to die, guys. Alright, this is exciting. We have a new Sanji curse being unlocked. The previous Sanji curse was that anyone who lit his cigarette ended up dying, which happened to both Ace and Pedro. But we have a brand new carrying old man curse that started on Egghead Island, where Sanji was entrusted to get a wounded old man to safety, and he did a good job for about a panel and a half until that old man's safety was compromised by getting shot through the stomach by a Marine Admiral. Certainly not Sanji's finest work there, so seeing him be the one to take charge of Scopogaban's safety does reopen some old man wounds. However, I am actually really excited for this pairing. I won't go too deeply into it here because I have a whole video coming out about it soon, but Sanji is potentially in need of a mentor, and there is no one more suited for that role than Scopogaban. He is the Roger Pirate equivalent of Sanji, and Gaban could even teach Sanji the salacious secrets of the power of love. Which makes it sound like they're gonna bang. They're not, I think. But both of them do believe in love as a literal power system. And we're still waiting to resolve the plot thread of whether or not Sanji has Conqueror's Haki, because we as readers never heard Gaban's answer to Sanji's question. And so I am very, very keen to see what comes of this, because this could lead to a phenomenal Sanji upgrade. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is the first Devil Fruit user that also wields a Devil Fruit weapon. Alright, so I can't remember all of the non-canon examples off the top of my head, but I believe this is correct. Aside from Blackbeard, Loki is essentially the first dual Devil Fruit wielder through this partnership. Generally, objects imbued with Devil Fruits tend to be given out to make up for something, like Fungfried being given to Spandam, or something like Mr. Four using Lasso because it complemented his baseball style. Actually, look, if you want to get real technical, Tama might predate Loki in the series, not the timeline. It really does depend on how much you consider her teapot Bunbuku as something that was being wielded by her, although I guess it's not a weapon, although it could thwack someone with those massive balls, my god. And if you want to get stupidly technical, then Caesar Clown also sort of wielded Smiley, which is fairly true because he did end up absorbing the quote-unquote weapon when Smiley died. I don't know, I'm just being... I'm gonna go ahead and say that Loki is the first good example we have, but not the only one that we could have possibly had. Because when Oda revealed which devil fruits each of the non-fruit using Straw Hats would have, he identified that Zoro would use Kaido's devil fruit, but imbued into one of his swords, which would be absolutely incredible to see. Would the Elbaph alphabet be called the alphabet? Yes. Is Luffy doing Soul's laugh at the end? Yeah, so they do sound kind of similar, but this is actually Luffy's regular laugh. He goes shi, which is the second part of Soul's laugh, and possibly why Robin was also so intrigued with Luffy in addition to being captured by the D. However, despite Luffy laughing like this all the time, this may still be new to you because this does not come across in the English translation. The first time that Luffy does laugh is in chapter 69. In Japanese, it's shi, but in English, it's translated as he. And I believe that has remained pretty consistent throughout the official translation, but I do get it because to general English speakers, it's not immediately apparent that this is a laugh. But as always, it does take away a nice little layer of nuance because, as the commenter pointed out, Monkey D. Luffy and Jaguar D. Soul do actually have a slight connection to one another through their respective laughs, as well as their heritage as Will of D clan members. But you let me know what you're thinking about all of the everything it is that I just said in the comments below, which I may or may not read. Emu has just made a world-ending mistake. The world government have lost the final war before it even began, as the truth of King Harold has spread throughout Elbaph, and the strongest army in the world has now been mobilized against Emu. I really cannot emphasize just how important and just how hype this chapter is. Jarl's speech, it set me on fire. It made me want to punch a silhouette. But this week, we should probably start with the cover page because it features one of the most beloved faces in all of One Piece. As we get to see Bon Clay, and not just that, but Bon Clay in his alabaster outfit, which is extremely nostalgic. I love it, but I am seeing a little bit of confusion on the internet, and I would just like to take a moment to point out that this is not a cover story, this is a cover art request. So what we're seeing here isn't actually what's happening. It's just a fun idea seeing some swans raid Bon Clay's makeup. But what this does is remind me that it has been 14 years since the last time that we saw Bon Clay in the One Piece manga, which was on the cover of chapter 666 titled Yeti Cool Brothers. So we are talking the Punk Hazard era, where it was revealed that Bon Clay did survive Magellan, and he is now the new queen of level 5.5, and has also gone back to wearing that classic alabaster era swan outfit. And that is always worth mentioning, because if you're an anime only watcher, they never show you that Bon Clay survived. In fact, the implication of the anime is that he is dead, very dead. Rest assured though, he is not, and he will be back for the final war, possibly leading a second Impel Down jailbreak. Now, into the actual chapter, let's not be too gentle with our words here. The first 4 pages of chapter 1172 are kind of unnecessary if you've been paying attention to the arc. If you're the kind of person who watches strange men on the internet talk about fictional pirates, then you probably did not need these 4 pages. With my caveat here being that I think they're very necessary if you're a more casual reader, which is what the vast majority of One Piece readers are. And so the chapter begins with a lovely elevator ride from the underworld to the sunworld, and our characters are recapping everything that happened right before the flashback began. In particular, Scopa identifies 3 holy knights, a Gunko, a Summers, and a Killingham, and he explains their devil fruit abilities to everyone on the elevator, which is all of our underworld characters with the notable exceptions of Luffy and Loki, who I will say, very annoyingly, we do not see in this chapter. That's quite disappointing because we ended 1171 with Loki finally being freed and getting the opportunity to kick into gear after a year and a half of waiting, and well, now we're gonna have to wait a bit longer. And that's kind of the overall theme of this chapter, to the point where I'm seeing this being described a lot as a filler chapter, which it is definitely not. One of the most important moments in One Piece world history happens in this chapter, which I am so excited to talk about. In defense of the recap, like I said, most One Piece readers have just experienced a 6-month break from Elbaph to go through all of the flashback stuff, and so I do think it's reasonable for Oda to assume that many people may have forgotten what's actually going on here. And at the very least, it does make a lot of sense in world because most of the characters on the elevator weren't present for all the Sunworld stuff, so now they're all caught up and now we can start doing some things. But speaking of the Sunworld stuff, what happens once the elevator reaches the top is we get a catch-up, which is not the same thing as a recap. A catch-up is new information because we get to see what everyone is doing right here, right now, this very instant. And because we're now in the big action climax, this is the point in time where Oda needs to break out the old minimap. And what's happening on Elbaph according to this minimap is surprisingly complicated. There's a lot more separate parts happening here than I remembered. Although the one that I took the greatest note of is the group of tied up straw hats, now not including Brook. Apparently he just got up and wandered off somewhere, which is fun. Because the last time that we saw Brook was in chapter 1150, having been mostly mummified by Gunko's arrow fabrics. So the idea that since then he's just gotten up and left, I find that pretty funny personally, especially since Brook left without freeing the rest of the crew as well. So the obvious thought that I think we're all having here is that Brook may have finally realized who Gunko is, and so he might be going to try to break through to her, which may trigger a whole second flashback, a Brook flashback, or at the very least a small Gunko flashback. But I would also like to register a potential funny warning here, because this is Brook we're dealing with. His comical aspects are a degree more enhanced than most of the rest of the crew, and it really does depend on how meta Oda wants to be here. For example, if he has purposely given us just enough information for us to assume that Brook is going after Gunko, then he may very well subvert that by having Brook stroll up to Imu and say, "Young lady, I almost forgot. May I please see your panties?" And perhaps it is only then that Brook finally finally realizes who this is, quite possibly by recognizing the panties in question. Because panty theory, of course, states that Brook has been asking every woman he finds to see their panties in the hopes that he will one day find that familiar pair that he's looking for. So we'll see about that. However, other Brook theorists have also proposed that he will be the key to dispelling Domi Reversi, because he does have command in the realm of souls and spirits and such, of which there are many great canon examples in the series, but I'm going to choose a non-canon one, which is this cover request on chapter 788, where Brook is performing a cursed song, taking advantage of evil spirits to do so. So I could see Brook being a solution to this problem. He may be able to drive out the innate evil of the Domi Reversi within the Giants, and perhaps even Gunko as well. Also, we might even be able to control it. But at this stage, my money would still be on Brook speaking from the heart that he no longer has, to break through to Gunko and at least temporarily free her from Imu's control. Look, there's a lot happening here, but the overall idea that Copacabana landed on was that they needed to take out all three Devil Fruit abilities. And so I believe that we've now split into groups that are going to conveniently align and merge with other groups to take on that idea. One of those groups is Road, Gerd, and Goldberg. They have become a cell, and this is because we discover that Road has a little brother, Bjorn, one of the captured children, so I believe that this is going to open up an avenue of potential Road redemption. I can see Road trying to save Bjorn and getting all torn up by the thorns of St. Summers, but being so relentless about it that we cannot help but feel for Road and forget all of the weird pervy shit he did in the beginning of the arc. And maybe he could even earn some credit with Gerd, who Road has a bit of a thing for. Meanwhile, Zoro, Haradin, and Stanson form a cell to protect Yara from Dorian Broggy, which is a team up that I am very excited for, because Zoro and Haradin together again, it makes me very nostalgic for Dressrosa, particularly the moment where Haradin defeated Mark of Ice, and Zoro was ever so impressed that he said, "Sleep tight, and when you wake, the cage will be gone." It's very rare for Zoro to have dialogue like that, and it shows the great respect that he has for Haradin, so I think that they are going to be an amazing team. And of course, Sanji has gone off to rescue Nami and Robin, whoever else happens to be with Nami and Robin. They're not important. So now we have completely split up our monster trio again, and something's definitely going to go wrong here, isn't it? Because Oda is doing the classic Oda thing of keeping Luffy and Loki out of the picture until a very dire moment arrives. Like on Alabasta, when Luffy was absent during the Baroque Works fight and only made his return at the right moment to save Vivi from Crocodile. Or like the Arlong arc, where Luffy spent most of that fight having a bit of a swim until everyone except Arlong was beaten and it was time to punch that fish in the face. Or like Skypiea, when Luffy is in a snake and other things happen, he eventually gets out to beat Enel. This happens a lot. So Luffy and Loki are purposely being kept away from the action for a while. And so as helpful as Zoro and Sanji are going to be, they're not going to be the ones solving too many of these problems. Which is interesting because it's actually a bit of a weird arc, because we only have, yes, 3 antagonists to deal with. But to be fair, they are gods, or so they claim. And on that note, something that I would like to highlight is some very, very fine art in this chapter. And mate, I am talking about museum quality stuff, which is this sort of 2-page spread of Imunko and the Holy Knights. I love how this is composed because it gives the illusion that the 3 of them are together in a group, but what Oda's gone and done is constructed a modern triptych, which is one of my favorite styles of painting because I find dividing frames into 3s bizarrely satisfying, and they generally tell a united story in 3 parts. So we've got Summers, Imu, and Killingham all in different locations, but all being framed like they're together. I love it, and I think this works very well considering the nature of the subjects. We have Imu and his 2 holy knights, so God and 2 of his disciples. I like this a lot because the classic fine art triptych would usually involve some sort of holy subject matter depicting perhaps Jesus, other Bible events, but also very commonly the stories of saints. So Oda has used an artistic device that is very much traditionally linked to religion, and I think it is perfect for the self-professed saints and gods that we are featuring here. And look, I don't know if Oda has done this on purpose to reflect that, but I'm inclined to say that he has, because I've never seen him draw anything quite like this in One Piece, and it works fantastically well for these particular characters. And something else I couldn't help but notice is that underneath the triptych, there are a couple of panels, one of which is dedicated to Ronya, Oda, the girl who, if you remember, was willing to sacrifice her own life to save the school and the library because she thought that burning them down would make everyone unhappy. Which all takes place during Jarl's death speech, which is absolutely the crowning moment of this chapter. And I mean, there's no guarantee that he's gonna die, but he thinks he is. He thinks he's making a death speech, and for good reason. The Domi Reversi, Dori, and Broggy were ordered by Imu to kill Jarl. I'm not too worried about that though, because Zoro, he has a plan, which I'm much more worried about the actual plan, but we'll get into that in a bit. But Jarl proceeds to broadcast the truth about Harold and Loki to the entire island, which is a moment that I both predicted and feared. Not that predicting this was anything special. The truth about Harold was pretty certain to come out in a rather dramatic fashion like this. In fact, it's even one of the squares on the 2026 Grand Line Review bingo board. So that is nice and green now. We are off to a great start to the year. However, the reason why I did fear this moment is because in the hands of a lesser author, this could have been a complete disaster. Because it is such an incredibly difficult proposition for a writer to satisfyingly change the minds of an entire civilization through one short speech. This sort of thing does happen in a lot of other shonen manga, quite a bit in One Piece as well. You know, the big speech to change the minds of all of the people it is who are listening. And it's often very, very difficult for me to buy in other series. But I think that Oda has a unique mastery of this sort of convincing writing, and what helps me a lot is the context in which Jarl's speech is taking place, which is on Elbaph to the citizens of Elbaph, a society that prioritizes honor above all. And so it's not even a question in a single person's minds that Jarl is telling the truth. That is taken as obvious just by nature of their culture. But also the way that Jarl words these events is, it's very convincing, isn't it? He says that he and Loki had to lie because otherwise the Elbaphians would have risen in vengeance for Harold, and thus risk returning them to the more savage, warmongering states that their ancestors occupied, essentially throwing away Harold's dream. Which, as a side note, this is exactly what Imu wants. He desires an army of savage blood-lustering giants. And look, by the end of this chapter, Imu gets exactly that. It's just not an army that's under his control. So this is a very be careful what you wish for sort of situation. Something I do really love though is that Jarl, he does leave out some of the more incriminating parts of Loki's story, which Haruden picks up on, and he says that Jarl is being far too flattering. And I'm really enjoying the way that the Haruden-Loki dynamic has now evolved, because it's starting to feel more classically brotherly. I mean, I don't have siblings myself, but I have seen siblings in movie films, and they do tend to act comically petty, which is the mode that older brother Haruden appears to be settling into. But it's also worth noting that Jarl, he was very selective about how he described Harold, wasn't he? He spoke of Harold as a man who fought against the devil, and it was this devil who slew Harold as well as the soldiers. What Jarl doesn't mention is Harold making a deal with that devil and becoming a devil himself, so that part of Harold's story, it is likely to be kept a secret. But I do think that it's also very true to the spirit of Harold. Even though it was his hand who slew those soldiers, Harold ended up in that situation because he was, perhaps naively, fighting for Elbaph, which is then skillfully transitioned into a call to take up arms to follow in Harold's footsteps and fight for Elbaph. And I love what Jarl says here about not expecting the rest of Elbaph to have the patience that Harold did. This warning, it is amazing. Addressing Imu and the Holy Knight straight on and saying, do you even know who you're speaking to? And mark my words, this speech is going to go down as one of the great moments of One Piece. Because as I'm reading Jarl's words, I can hear the soundtrack of the anime playing alongside of them, and I am getting chills just thinking about it again whilst recording this here video. And it's so good. It's just so damn good, because Jarl has mostly been played for comedy so far. You know, as the senile old man making the sword jokes, and the helmet had stopped it. But as Haruden states, this dude was one of the most powerful people in the entire world, El Mundo, 300 years ago. And I love seeing that fire, that willpower returning to Jarl for one last stand. However, very importantly, Jarl's final call to action, despite what I may or may not title this video, Jarl's call is not to declare war on the world government, which would be a very natural conclusion to a speech like this. Instead, Jarl continues to masterfully preserve the legacy of Harold by calling on the giants not to declare war, but to protect peace. And so what we are about to see is a fusion of the past and the future in the present. We're going to see the proud traditions of Elbaph working in tandem with Harold's vision for the future. And it has got me seriously hyped. And I'm not the only one either, because Oda does choose to showcase the reactions of certain characters during all of this, one of which is Usopp, and he is now completely fired up. Jarl has ignited Usopp's inner giant, and I'm really hoping that this is the start of Usopp doing something to protect the peace of this culture that he looks up to more than anything else. Usopp, mate, this is your moment. Please do not disappoint me. But other than Usopp, the most interesting reaction to me is Imu's. We cut to Imu quite a few times, and he's never saying or doing anything. That latter one, that's probably more surprising. He's just letting Jarl speak with seemingly no urgency to stop it, and this is such a huge mistake. What's happening here may have been a lot shorter, but this is a Vegapunk level speech. The sort of thing that the 5 Elder Stars so desperately tried to stop on Egghead Island, because allowing this truth to get out has now mobilized all of Elbaph against the world government, whereas their previous position was neutrality and even leaning into joining them. And this is obviously real bad. Not for us. For them, because we've been told that whichever side the giants land on in the final war will be integral to the outcome. And I believe that Imu is, well, he's being so extremely arrogant here. He doesn't care at all about these words that are being said because he believes that he will either be able to Domi Reversi or just kill everyone. What we are witnessing here, like I said right at the very beginning of this video, is the world government losing the final war before it even begins. Because I do personally believe Jarl's words. Who do you think you're talking to? You're going to threaten Elbaph with your pitiful concept of domination? Good luck, mate. This is a disaster. All that's been accomplished here is Imu reviving one of his worst enemies in their prime form. Perhaps even something even greater than a prime form, because they're fighting not just for the sake of fighting anymore. And I'm sure that Imu will come to realize this by the end of the arc. Well, I don't know, maybe not. Imu is a little bit delusional. Although I should note that there is still a darker potential ending where Imu does win, inflicts all sort of despairs, takes command of the giants, and we enter the final war with them on his side. But I don't see that as very likely at the moment, not after Jarl's speech. Now, as much as I do love the speech, one minor thing I would add is that it is the second profound death speech in a row for One Piece now. We just had the Vegapunk death speech on Egghead Island, where he spoke some uncomfortable truths which went on to change the world, and what happened here with Jarl is more or less the same thing on a smaller yet larger scale. Larger because they're giants. And as much as I enjoyed both of these, I hope that Oda doesn't lean too heavily into this device, if at all, in future arcs, because it may risk becoming a bit tropey. For example, I can see a big moment in, during, or after the final war where someone is broadcasting to the entire world, maybe let's say Nico Robin revealing the truth about the Void Century, because the whole world is gonna have to find out about this somehow. So we are gonna have at least one more big world-changing broadcasted speech. But again, I'm hoping that Oda doesn't do it too much more. However, the other character that this speech has animated is Zoro, who is all pumped up, and this man has a plan, which is, concerning. Zoro having a plan, it should ring some pretty dramatic alarm bells, because Zoro is very similar to Luffy in a lot of ways, not always good ways. And one of those ways is that whenever Zoro has a plan, it usually turns out to be quite similar to when Luffy has a, quote, interesting idea. And if you ever hear those words from Luffy, what that means is you vacate the area immediately, because something real dumb's about to happen. And it is the exact same thing when Zoro formulates a plan. So let's explore the kind of thing that we could perhaps expect from the mind of Zoro in this next chapter. One of Zoro's iconic plans occurred on Little Garden when he came to the conclusion to cut off his own legs in order to escape Mr. Three's wax candelabra. An idea that I should say Broggy was very much on board with, even though it involved cutting off both of his hands and both of his feet. So maybe what we could see is a bit of a callback where Zoro's plan might be to slice off off Broggy's hands and feet, or even try to restrain him like Mr. 3 did with the wax swords in his hands and legs. That'd be a fun solution, brutal but fun, and it might even work with just a little sprinkling of Conqueror's Haki stirred into the sword soup. I do have a few other ideas for where Zoro's plan is going to take us. I'm gonna say that none of them are good, and I will get into all of those in the next video, but you let me know what you think Zoro's plan is, as well as any other thoughts that you have regarding the chapter in the comments below. Someone else pointed this out, but Zoro may say, Dory, Broggy, who's the strongest? And have them turn on each other. So this is a very fun idea for several reasons. The first is that Little Garden was when the Zoro-Sanji rivalry was cemented. Yes, they'd had some antagonistic encounters before. However, Little Garden is the arc where these two had their contest and ended up doing exactly the incident that caused Dory and Broggy to spend a whole century trying to settle their own argument. And I tend to focus on Usopp a lot when speaking about the spirit of the giants, but Zoro is very much dangerously on that same wavelength as well. He very much understands and empathizes with positions of pride. And if he's smart, which is a big if, Zoro could use that to his advantage to turn Dory and Broggy against each other, locking them in a stalemate whilst they find a way to reverse the reversey. It could be a simple question like, who would win in a fight? Is it Dory or Broggy? Or perhaps who will become king of Elbaph? Maybe even which one of you was going to kill Jarl. It can't be both of you. Only one can do the final killing. And this will never happen, but it would be so funny if Zoro took on the role of that little girl way back when and accidentally starts another century-long feud between the demon Dory and Broggy, and perhaps 100 years from now, the protagonist of Two Piece will be setting out on his adventure and suddenly encounter two demonic giants who have been locked in battle combat for over 100 years. It is clever though, because this idea takes full advantage of the pride and honor of the Elbaph warriors, which is a feeling so powerful that it could at least partially break through Imu's control. If Bartholomew Kuma could not be completely domineered by Saint Saturn after everything that was done to him, then I have faith that Dory and Broggy's strong willpower could play a part here, because powerful emotions do interact with Domi Reversi, as it did appear that Rox was only able to be taken control of after being goaded by Imu. And if the reverse happens, if Zoro reminds these two of their honors and their prides, then that could reduce Imu's command. The issue here is that it requires a lot of self-awareness from Zoro. He needs to recognize that, they're kind of like me, and what would annoy a kind of like me? And Zoro's plans, I have to say, they're generally not quite this well thought out. To highlight another of Zoro's classic plans, on Enisobi he had the wonderful idea to play some rock, paper, scissors with Sogeking, and the loser had to cut their hand off in order to free them from one another. And on Dressrosa, Zoro came up with a suite of plans to deal with Pika, 5 in total, but eventually settling on the best of all the ideas, which was to be thrown like a cannonball by Olympus. And I do think that that was his best plan in the series so far, if only because it didn't involve Zoro cutting off his own limbs. But in the worst case scenario, the most horrifying plan we've seen from Zoro was aboard the sea train at Enisobi when he declared that he would leave everyone's fate to luck. So whatever's coming up here, I don't know if it's going to be good, but mate, it's going to be entertaining. And I've also heard it suggested that Zoro's plan may be to cut the branch of the Atom Tree itself. Branch number 8, the one that seemingly everyone except for Luffy and Loki are currently active on. And I do think that would be very fun, because it would give us another source of Atom Wood to make some great things out of, perhaps an upgrade for the Thousand Sunny, or maybe even a ship for Loki to set out to sea with or without the Straw Hats. It could even be gifted to the crew as a reward for saving the island, like when the Skypian citizens wanted to gift all the gold. That's not the gold that the Straw Hats ended up getting, but the gold that they stole ended up being the proceeds that built the Thousand Sunny. The lift scene is like seeing the loading times before entering the boss stages. Yes, it is exactly like that. Not just the boss stages though either. In some sort of adventure game, when you're waiting for a zone to load and the game just decides to fill that space with a quick tip. Like, remember, these kind of enemies attack like this, or they're weak to this. That's what's happening here. On the elevator ride up, Scopper Bomb is going through the different enemy types and the overall point of the mission. And then the zone finally loaded and our characters were immediately thrust into the chaos of the nightmare creatures. I won't be surprised if Summers actually falls asleep while Imu battles everyone around and notices him, then proceeds to wake him up with a slap to the face. So in this chapter, St. Summers, he had clearly gotten bored of the game. So tiresome. It's no longer fun. They've practically already won. An old man wants to take a nap. So look, I also wouldn't be surprised if that nap actually happens, but it might be for a different reason. Oda could be setting Summers up for a mid-afternoon nap for some purpose to do with St. Gillingham's Devil Fruit abilities. We've already seen Gillingham go into the dreams of Summers to pull out some salt, so they could end up being a rather interesting combination. If Gillingham starts having trouble, then he could just whip out whatever horrid things that St. Summers is dreaming of to help him. Remembering that St. Summers is a terrible, terrible man. He has a very active imagination in all of the wrong child torturing ways. Or this could just be Oda highlighting how much of a prick he is. There's a catastrophe happening all around him, and St. Summers, he's bored. It's all a bit too vanilla for him, and he needs to add another cruel twist to keep himself interested. Did Jarl just pull the sword out of his head on the last page? Metal! Yeah, it's very nice of you to add what the sword is made out of at the end of that sentence. Very helpful and educational. But to answer the question, I would love it if he did, but I'm not sure, and I'm leaning on no, because we definitely don't see any panel of Jarl, taking the sword out. However, when he declares that Elbaph will protect the peace that Harold dreamed of, Jarl is suddenly holding a sword, the guard of which is shaped a lot like Harold's blade. And again, I love the idea. It would be such a top 10 moment if Jarl grasped the sword in his head and ripped it out before launching into battle combat. But unfortunately, I do think this is just his standard sword. We have seen it before, and it does look enough like Harold's blade that they could be mistaken in any given drawing. And plus, if you do look closely at his head on the manga page, it's a little bit unclear, but we do see something sticking out of it. So phenomenal idea in my opinion, top tier fan fiction, and yeah, maybe it'll happen in the future. Sword's probably going to get out at some stage, but I think that Harold's sword is still well and truly embedded in Jarl's head. The swans in the cover had a straw hat and an emu crown. So this is referring to our cover page with Bon Clay. We have 3 swans, each one of which is raiding Bon Clay's makeup and seemingly cosplaying a bit. The swan in the back is making itself up in the guise of Bon Clay. And we also have one wearing a straw hat, but then there is this swan to the right with a crown, which could be one of those generic Oda crowns. However, its slender nature does lend itself to the idea of being the top of Emu's head, which may or may not be a crown, but is shaped like a crown regardless. Although I'm not sure if this is supposed to be a reference to Emu or even a reference to anything. I mean, maybe it's just a summary of Bon Clay's identity. One swan has his swan outfit on, whereas the other with the straw hat is demonstrating his loyalty to bestest friend Luffy. And the crown could just be representing his status as the new queen of level 5.5. It could be that simple. I like Hajirain's face when he talks about young Jarl. It's like a kid that has heard this story more than 1,000,000 times. Yeah, I know, look at this. Haradin's face is one of a very, very tired young man, as if the legend of Jarl, the legend, is one of those stories that gets passed around so commonly, like your parents relentlessly telling you about the day that you were born. Fun fact, every year on my birthday, my mother recounts in great detail the exact story of how I was born. And the face that Haradin is making is the face I make to that. But look, what I'm very interested in is not my own birth. It's the time period that Haradin mentioned. As 300 years ago, that's a time period that we know almost nothing about. The one thing we do know is that approximately 300 years ago is when the German kingdom took over North Blue for exactly 66 days, briefly turning it into the German Empire. Other than that, we have a complete deficit of knowledge of that century. In fact, we as readers actually know far more about the Void Century than we do that century. It was 100 years after Nolan's execution and 100 years before Emmett woke up and attacked Marijois. And this is how I know that no matter how much longer One Piece goes on for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, it'll never be enough, because there is so much potential to tell the story of this world at any given point in the last 900 years of history. Because I would crave to see a world where the great Yorl and Jarl were considered the mightiest at their peak. I want to know what kind of problems and what sort of enemies they faced. I want to know what the world government looked like at the time. I'd love to know who the big name pirates were and who the ranking marine admirals were. And you could do this for every single century with a whole series of its own. There is so much potential in this fictional world that I don't think we're ever going to be able to properly explore. When it showed Usopp fanboying over Jarl's words, I thought he comically turned into a giant for a minute just seeing Nami next to his giant head. Yeah, perspective is trippy sometimes, especially after having spent so long on an island full of giants. Your brain kind of reprograms itself to judge scale and perspective differently. But I love this panel because Usopp is going full Sanji here, except he isn't simping for women. No. He is simping for Elbaph. He's got the heart eyes, the tongue out, the full Sanji experience, and that is what gives me hope that Usopp is going to get into the game, because Sanji would never ever sit on the sidelines whilst a woman was in danger, and I'm hoping that since Usopp is showing the same brand of reaction, that he's not just going to sit by whilst Elbaph is in danger. Man on the internet, surely you must agree that Oda is saving Frankie for some kind of Mr. Prince type hidden objective? I don't know, I think that Frankie's objective is pretty clear at the moment. The last time we saw him, he was rallying to go off and save the kids, and Ripley said that she'd come as well, and now they are both assumedly part of the child rescue team, but to the best that my eyes can perform, I do not recall seeing Frankie in this chapter. I've tried zooming in and in on Ripley, but all that did was distract me, and what was I talking about? All right, Frankie. Yeah, he might do something fun. So to mention the whole Brook just standing up and walking away without freeing the others thing, I don't think he did. I would assume that his body is still tied up, but his soul left his body to go find Gunko. Brook is one of the very few Straw Hats who can have his body completely bound, but still go do stuff. He can go do so much stuff. But I think what confuses my pitiful mind brain is that we don't see his body at all. It appears to have completely vanished. When we saw Brook previously, he was tied up in a group with the rest of the crew, snuggled up between Usopp and Jinbei. However, in this chapter, we see no such Brook. But sure, let's say it's an art thing, and he could be using his soul powers. So instead of physically approaching Gunko, he might do it in soul form. Remembering that this man is the Soul King. His music is designed to speak from the soul and to be heard by the souls, not the ears, the souls of others. So perhaps in this case, Brook can just speak from the soul a bit more literally, and he and Gunko can reconnect beyond the physical realm that Imu is currently in command of. A few of my friends don't even remember about Road or the Lego Kingdom, and do genuinely read every week. Road is definitely redeemable. He is, they always are. One Piece is a story that often takes so long to tell that you just forget a lot of the horrible things that people have done. Even Caesar Clown, who is infinitely worse than Road, one of the most deplorable beings in the series, is now viewed as quite a delightful comic relief character. And if the dude who abducted and drugged children can be redeemed, then no one is off limits. So back to Road. For the first time in ever, I'm actually excited to see what he does. Because again, this dude, he's no Caesar. Road is so many steps above Caesar. And it's playing into the general theme of love that Elbaph has been exploring. Road is part of this now, and we are going to find out exactly what he'll do to save his little brother for the love of his family on what we're going to call the road to redemption. In the chapter notes, Oda says he saw a quokka for the first time. Doesn't that animal reside in the land of VB? Mate, they sure do. In fact, if you go to Western Australia, there's an island you can visit. It's called Rottnest Island. Terrible name. But it is an island packed with quokkas. So many quokkas. And it is highly recommended if you're ever in Western Australia for some reason, because there aren't that many reasons to go there. Generally, if you visit Australia, you just go to Sydney or Melbourne instead, you know? The good ones. Sure, maybe it's a bad idea for a giant like Goldberg to eat one of the God's Knights. His shield might be able to do it though. Yes, Goldberg, who is my favorite member of the new Giant Warrior Pirates, did suggest maybe we could eat the Holy Knights, which is a very Luffy-like response to the problem, and it's probably a good thing that Luffy wasn't in the elevator, because he would have gone, yeah, is a good idea. But Goldberg might mean this in a different way. We haven't really gotten too deeply into this, but Goldberg's shield is a homie named Nash, which was created when Goldberg's father went on an expedition to take down the large maternal figure, but that didn't work out too well. However, chaos ensued. Big Mom apparently created a shield homie, and so they took that home with them. So perhaps Goldberg is referring to Nash eating the Holy Knights. It is a colossal shield, and he always has his mouth open like he's hungry. And if not a Holy Knight, night, then maybe he can eat some of the nightmares. Was it only my impression, or did Harudin seemed to specifically look at the Nidhogg when they all reached the upper realm? Could it be reminded him of someone he's seen transform into something similar? So I didn't consciously register this during the first read-through, mostly because this happens on that beautifully chaotic 2 pages of emerging into the sun world. It's such a feast for the eyes, there's so many little cool details. But Oda did select 2 close-ups to showcase, one of Harudin and one of the Nightmare Nidhogg, which we currently suspect to be Loki's devil fruit, and the form of the Nidhogg is also quite dominant in the other panels on these pages as well. The Nidhogg seems to be one of the only nightmare creatures to be colored in black, whereas the rest of them are more like the black and white equivalent of a light pastel coloring, which draws the eyes to the Nidhogg in each and every one of these panels. And this could be another case of us and people on the internet reading far too much into every little detail on a weekly basis, but I could very much see Oda drawing our attention to the Nidhogg in order to set up the reveal of Loki's devil fruit, setting up this more juvenile imagination of the creature before sack-whacking us with the powerful fictional reality of what a Nidhogg really is. And also among this panel of chaos, we can see the evil sun god Nika. He's a very interesting one. It feels a bit more detailed than the previous Nightmare Nika we saw, and this panel also gives the illusion that there are flames coming out of his back, almost like a Lunarian. I'm a bit 50-50 on this though. It could be that these are just background flames in a strategically relevant area, because this entire section of Elbaph, it is just sporadically ablaze. But I do very much like the look of those flames, and Nika having been a Lunarian, it is still very much on the table. But in addition to that, it should also be said that the numerous Nightmare Knights, I guess nightmares with a K we could just call them, who have now appeared do seem to have actual flames emanating from their napes. So they could be how the children of Elbaph were taught to view the Lunarians. And I'm not hugely confident about that, but we could be getting a glimpse of the past here. A look into the history that the children of Elbaph know, but that we are currently being kept unaware of. And I have pointed this out in the past as well when the nightmare creatures were first summoned, but this whole scene, it looks so much like the Elbaph mural, which was also said to have been drawn by a child. I am a big fan of how Oda set that up, and we could actually go on to see an even more detailed reenactment of the Elbaph mural if Imu reaches a point where he has to activate his colossal demonic form, if he does have one, the mural would say that he does, and take on Luffy in Gear 5th. It's just so stupidly clever, giving away the history of the One Piece world with this child's drawing, and then literally bringing this history to life by tapping into the imagination of modern children. Because what we have playing out right in front of us now is a legend and a myth that no one will be able to believe 1,000 years from now when the mural of the events of this day are shown to the children of Elbaph a millennia into the future. And it even makes me rethink the original mural. Perhaps it wasn't drawn by a child. Perhaps it was drawn by an extremely accurate artist, and it happens to be an extremely accurate depiction of what happened back in the first and second worlds. There's just no way of ever knowing in a series with the infinite potential of One Piece, but you let me know what you think about anything at all in the comments below. And if you're in the mood for some long-form One Piece content, then please do check out the Calm Belt. It's a whole channel where Grand Line review videos are compiled into 2 to 3 hour compilations, which also feature videos that for one reason or another never made it onto this channel. Curious, yes? And these are for you to have on while you're sleeping, drawing, gaming, or whatever other long-form activities you perform. So definitely check that out through the link in the description. The truth of Brook and Gunko has finally been revealed, and it's not what we thought, but that's okay though, because it's even better than what it is we thought. And elsewhere, everything happening on Elbaph is suddenly turning into our favor. Zora's plan is working out, the rest of the crew minus Robin are free, Gerd, Goldberg and Road did big tacky thing, plus Saint Summers has made a colossal and potentially immortality ending mistake. Plus, on the cover page, I think that Chopper's going to end up accidentally sucking off Usopp's nose. Who knows? One Piece, it's going a bit wild this week, and this chapter begins exactly where we left off with Zoro's plan. And congratulations to everyone who predicted that said plan was to goad Dory and Brogy into fighting one another, because whether he meant it or not, that is exactly what happened. I say that because what happened here isn't particularly clear from Oda, at least not as clear as I think could be. And we'll get into the setup in the previous attack in a bit, but the final moment of Zoro in the air about to slash Dory and Brogy has been interpreted by some people on the internet as Zoro suddenly being unable to attack because he has emotions at his friends, etc. And I really do wish that it was drawn or presented a bit better, because what actually happened here is genius for Zoro. At the very last second, he uses his attack to propel himself out of the way, so that Dory and Brogy would end up striking each other whilst aiming for him. It is the very classic get in the middle of two enemies and make them hit each other tactic. And it worked. It worked out really well. It's just not Oda's finest art in my opinion, because I'm seeing a lot of confusion. And this also extends to Zoro's reaction afterwards, where he looks incredibly shocked. I think it's because he's in awe of the shockwave of the powers that he is feeling from the strength emanating from Dory and Brogy. But admittedly, I can also see how some people do interpret this as Zoro not intending for Dory and Brogy to hit each other and being surprised that they did. Again, I do think that Oda could have depicted this scene with a lot more clarity. However, the initial attack that came right before this, masterful. Zoro leaps above the heads of the giants so as not to get Domi reversied. In his attack here, it is very cool and packed with a ton of fun meaning, like the combat poet that Zoro is. This attack is called the Rokudo no Suji, which translates as crossing of the six paths. And if you're familiar with Naruto, then you may have an idea where this is going, because six path terminology pops up quite a bit in Naruto. But the six paths, as with much of Zoro's attack theming, finds its basis in Buddhist cosmology, and it represents the six worlds where sentient beings are reincarnated according to their karma. So essentially, once your being dies, it finds its way to the six paths and is granted a particular path based on the actions of the previous life. You can be reincarnated as a celestial being, you can be reincarnated as a human or a war-mongering demigod, also an animal and a hungry ghost, and you can even reincarnate smack bang in the middle of hell. And I love what's happened here, because the very principle of Domi Reversi is kind of like a reincarnation. Imu has taken Dory and Brogy off the path of the warmongering demigods, and he has reincarnated them in hell, which is why they look like very stereotypical devilly demons. Although from Imu's perspective, he may believe that they're being reincarnated as celestial beings. They're not though, they're in hell, and that is a very unfortunate place to be in general, but especially now. Because now Dory and Brogy have to deal with a man who during the Wano arc proudly proclaims that he was going to become the king of hell. And that is why at the very end of the last chapter, the sword that we see Zoro unsheathing is Enma, with Enma obviously translating as king of hell. So this whole endeavor, it came together quite beautifully. It's not just a case of Zoro leaping into combat and doing a bit of the slicey dicey. No, Oda put a lot of thought into this single action, as he does with most named attacks, by the way. And I suppose part of the plan, thematically, would be to slice up all of the giants, with Zoro acting as the center of the six paths, and ideally reincarnating them back into their original forms and returning them into the human realm. If so, that would have been very wishful thinking. Sadly, it's not going to be that easy, but it did have quite a favorable outcome nonetheless, because Zoro successfully has now triggered a fight battle between Dory and Brogy. And this panel we have of Dory and Brogy fighting, it is amazing. It fills me with such an overwhelming sense of nostalgia, and that's very much on purpose, because it has been well over 1,000 chapters since we originally saw Dory and Brogy fighting, and as is often the case with One Piece, there is a lot more to this panel than you may initially appreciate, because it is a direct callback to the very first clash we see between Dory and Brogy all the way back in chapter 116, where I would point out that the dialogue accompanying it is, "The reason we fight is long forgotten," which brings us to chapter 1173, and the reason why Dory and Brogy are fighting each other now is forgotten as well, because they are under the command of Domi Reversi. They've forgotten themselves. And if you look at the sound effects, the katakana, both pages are using the same one. And I'm not sure if they should, because one key difference between the pages is that in the original shot, Dory and Brogy are both successfully blocking each other's weapons, which is the sound effect being made, but in the Domi Reversi form, they're easily slicing through the shields and even bodies of one another. So I guess guess that to some degree this is showing us the power-up component of Domi Reversi. Dory and Broggy are now both so strong that neither of them can even block the other, and it really emphasizes that both of them are now just weapons of Imu. There's no skill or pride in this combat, it's just cut and or be cut, and as mentioned before, the reason why they're fighting has been long forgotten. There is something quite hopeful about this though, if indeed I could use that word in this context, because them fighting each other in the exact same way, even after being Domi Reversi, just goes to show that some things can never be changed. And we don't see it in this chapter, but the most ideal outcome of this is that Dory and Broggy do regain some sense of themselves, or that some part of them remains even after Domi Reversi, and they start fighting each other, relishing the opportunity to battle a fellow immortal, with no concern for what even started the conflict, just like their original century-long feud on Little Garden. And it's almost as if Dory and Broggy have reached this strange state of paradise, because in their current bodies they're theoretically able to fight one another forever. But I would like to see Imu's control break down in the next chapter, because we know that Imu's control, mate, it is far from absolute. Roxdizabek somehow dispelled it entirely on God Valley right before he died. That may have been because of Roger and Garp, maybe it was also because Imu released him, but we do also see Gunko fighting and temporarily breaking Imu's control in this chapter. And so, this chapter, it has a moment that we, or at least I, have been waiting for quite some time, which is clarity of the Brook-Gunko relationship. And as it turns out, this dynamic is not as sweet as most of us had assumed, and Brook sought out Gunko because he believed her to be, or to be related to someone he once knew named Princess Shuri. And Brook's assumption is that Gunko is Shuri's descendant, as Shuri would be 80 years old today. So what we've got here is a Gunko age drop, and I'm probably wrong about this, but I think that Gunko might be the second oldest living human woman that we know of in One Piece. We have a lot of women in their 60s and 70s, your Shakis, your Bigger Mamas, and your Vice Admiral Surus. Not many in the 80 and beyond range though. Mother Carmel was 80, but she's very dead, got eaten like a birthday cake. But of course, Dr. Kureha is still by far our oldest woman, and in fact our oldest human at the moment. However, back to Gunko, Brook has some pretty harsh words regarding this Princess Shuri, and mate, we have never seen Brook like this. He is genuinely angry because he states that Princess Shuri killed her father, who I would assume is a king, and that father was someone very important to Brook, a benefactor, a mentor figure of sorts, someone to whom Brook owed so much. And to that, I would say that this king is the equivalent of what Shanks represented to Luffy. So I've mentioned this quite a few times during this arc, but way back on Thriller Bark, Brook did say that he was the leader of a battle convoy for a certain kingdom. And I imagine that this certain king ruled over that certain kingdom, making Gunko the certain princess of the certain kingdom. And so Gunko has officially joined the elite ranks of One Piece princesses. Every kingdom arc needs a princess, even if she's not from the kingdom that the arc is actually set in. And if there was still anyone who had any doubt that Gunko was going to be saved or flipped, then that has all got to be gone right now. She's a princess. She's gonna end up being good. It's just one of the established laws of One Piece. And let me just say that this explains one of the biggest questions that I've had with the Brook-Gunko relationship. I just found it so hard to believe that Brook knew that Gunko was out there, but essentially said F it and became a pirate, essentially ignoring her existence. But the fact that Brook seems to despise Princess Shuri quite adequately answers that. He knew that she existed, but he wanted nothing to do with her. But of course, as shocking of a reveal as this may seem on paper, this father-killing business doesn't really convince people like you and me, right? Because you and me, we know better. In fact, we've spent almost every chapter during the Elbaph arc, up until very recently, wrestling with the question of whether or not Loki killed his father. And it turns out that yes, Loki did, but it was for good reasons, and Loki was being hated for bad reasons. Bad, nasty, false reasons. So it is curious that immediately after we solve that, we reintroduce the same plotline with a different character. We're going to reuse the father killing and hatred-inducing feelings for Gunko, and usually when Oda does this, it is because there is a contrasting situation that he wants to explore. This happened during the recent flashback where Rox and Harold were set up to be directly contrasting figures. In the end, they were both taken control of by Imu. However, they got to that point via different paths. Rox openly rebelled against the world government, whilst Harold made a formal alliance with it. Two contrasting paths both concluding in the same outcome, not very hopeful, quite to spare some, and that was the entire point. And so if Oda is going to bring in another royal child kills their father plotline into play, it's probably going to be designed to directly contrast Loki, which does give us a couple of options. And you know what? Gunko actually having killed her father is certainly not off the table. The contrasting element could be that we're flipping the Loki-Harold dynamic, and Gunko, perhaps under the control of Imu, was forced to kill her father, which Brook witnessed but never learned the truth behind. Although I do hope it's something different to that, because to be perfectly honest, I am getting just a little bit tired of the solution to every problem being, Imu controlled that person and that's why that happened. If this happens with Gunko, that would be 3 times now. But I would be very surprised if we did not head into a full-on second Brook flashback very soon, because there is a lot that's been set up here. There's this whole secondary historical threads of the Holy Knights getting involved in another kingdom, resulting in the death of another king very important to Brook, and the fall of that kingdom, which probably led to Brook becoming a pirate in the first place. I don't imagine that it would be a long flashback, maybe a chapter or 2, but I hope that Oda does give this story the time it needs, and he doesn't try and blast through it like the Kaido flashback, because this is a straw hat we're talking about here. And one of the biggest complaints that I consistently hear about the New World Era is that the straw hats themselves do not get enough time, and I do periodically agree with that. So now we have an opportunity to get us some Brook, and I really hope that Oda takes it. But with all of that said, fantastically enough, as it turns out, the first Straw Hat to take on Imu is Brook. And there's a brilliant panel of Imunko colliding with Brook's shield, which is giving me some flashbacks of when Brook stood up to Big Mom. This musician doesn't afraid of anyone. Although I do find it funny that Dory and Broggy were both so powerful that they cut through each other's shields like butter. But Imu himself could not do the same to Brook's shield here. It might just be for the sake of fun story drama, but Imu may also be at a significant disadvantage in Gunko's body, as opposed to when he was able to possess Saint Saturn on God Valley. So Imu might be much more vulnerable right here than we believe, and if this goes on for a bit, then we are going to reach a point where Brook lasts longer against Imu than even Rox Dizabek did. Rox was caught pretty instantly. But as mentioned, Gunko does temporarily disable Imu's control, and she releases the arrow ability, which frees not only Brook, but also Jinbei, Nami, and Usopp. Not Robin though, because she was bound by Saint Summers, so he needs to be dealt with in order to free her. However, our auxiliary Straw Hats are now free to act, and I believe that Jinbei flags something interesting, very interesting, which is that he saw Ange, the school teacher, heading to the West Village, but he doesn't think she'll make it in time. And I point that out because who cares? Who cares what Ange is doing? I don't think you do. But the answer is that Oda cares. And he's been taking the time to make sure that we always know what Ange is doing and where she is. He's tracking her movements very specifically. And in fact, she was chosen as a close-up figure alongside Ronya in the last chapter. And I'm not saying that this means that Ange is a traitor we should be keeping an eye on, even though it is her actions that have given us the nightmare creatures to begin with. I just want it noted that Oda wants to keep Ange in our minds. So she's probably going to do something important. That something doesn't necessarily need to be bad. It could be in our favor, but just remember that she exists. And just as everyone but Robin is being freed, Sanji has arrived. We don't see him, but we do hear him namiswaning. And even though they're not in the same area at the moment, this could be setting up Sanji versus Saint Summers, because Robin is still bound by his powers, and I feel like Sanji would see freeing his precious Robin Chuan as a paramount priority. That's if he even gets there before Summers ends up destroying himself, because we do then cut to the West Village, and mate, Summers messed up on a Saint Saturn scale in this chapter. In the West Village, Ripley's team have caught up to the kids, although they're still kind of powerless. However, what I love is that they are confronted with the Nightmare Nika, who the kids claim to be the god of destruction. So the kids are all afraid, which I think is pretty reasonable. But there is an extremely underrated moment with the adults here, who despite seeing an incarnation of one of their gods, have no fear of said god, and they leap into action against him, including this woman here, who I think is the real version of the Nightmare Mother. And I love seeing her in action because this group is a real mix of Elbaph citizens, and it makes clear that each and every giant on this island has the spirit of a warrior. We've got this mix of pirates, guards, merchants, school teachers, housewives, it doesn't matter. Each and every one of them is a proud warrior. But unfortunately, that's not quite enough to bring down the fake Nightmare Nika, which is when Gerd, Goldberg, and Road arrive. And there is an extremely exciting exciting panel where Gerd and Goldberg assume a very familiar pose, which is the preparation for the signature technique of Elbaph. We first saw this on Little Garden, of course, with Dory and Broggy performing Hakoku Sovereignty, with Hakoku literally meaning warrior nation, and it's an attack that got used by both of them again in chapter 1079 to finish off what remained of Eustace Kid and the Victoria Punk. Because what Kid did was an assault on Elbaph as a whole, and this attack is played as the culmination of everything that is Elbaph. So it was Elbaph striking back. To be hit by this is to be assaulted by the very spirit of the country itself. And it's an attack so powerful and so respected that even non-Elbaphians have attempted to adopt it. In chapter 1009, during Roof Peace, Big Mom and Kaido terrifyingly assumed this stance, and due to his experience on Little Garden, Luffy knew that something big was coming. And that something big was a variant on the attack called Hakkai, which literally means Supremacy Sea, and was officially translated as Conquest of the Sea, which I quite like. And much like how Hakoku was a tangible embodiment of the spirit of Elbaph, Hakkai was designed to embody the philosophy of the conquest of the sea held by Big Mom and Kaido. But now in this chapter we have a third variant of the technique. Gerd, Goldberg, and Road come together to perform our very first three-man variant called Gokoku, meaning roaring nation. It's a very cool attack, and it makes me wonder what the limit is, if any. By which I mean, up until now, we've just assumed that this is a two-person attack. But if we can add a third, then can we do something ridiculous, like say, line up every single Elbaph warrior and have them participate in a single attack? Something absolutely beyond massive that would serve as the ultimate incarnation of it. Sounds like a potentially cool maneuver to use in some sort of final war. But it's also not lost on me that this attack hits the nightmare version of the sun god Nika. Oda could have chosen any nightmare monster for this moment, but he went out of his way to use Nika, and I think this is because the attack was witnessed by the children, one of whom assumedly is the one who conjured the evil Nika and is thus confronting their greatest fear. But I think that this is potentially setting up for something fun, because the kids have all just witnessed this nightmare Nika be defeated, and as soon as Luffy does make his way up to the Sun Realm, they're going to see him using Gear 5th, which will act as a direct contrast to the nightmare version, which should win the kids over to the Warrior of Liberation reading of the Sun God, as opposed to the God of Destruction reading which the nightmare represents. So the kids have seen the fake one, and Luffy's going to show them the real one. But even though it was fake, the nightmare Nika is still living up to this legend quite well, because after being hit by the Roaring Nation attack, he falls back onto Saint Summers, who thwacks Nika onto the ship that the children were being guided to, and he destroys it, which is an act of both liberation and destruction. Nika destroyed the ship, which in turn ends up liberating the children, because there is now no way for them to be taken off the island. No way that we know of, that is. And the last panel of this chapter is a close-up of Saint Summers saying Shimata, which can mean a lot of different things, but none of them are good. None of them should be good, because Saint Summers, oh my god. He knows just how bad this is. And he knows just how on the hook his life may be, because he made this screw-up happen. Remember that this entire time, Saint Summers has been sitting down, bored out of his mind, just waiting for what he thought was the inevitable to happen, and the only active action that he did take ended up ruining the entire plan. Plus, with what happened to Saint Saturn still very fresh in his mind, I would be pretty damn worried if I was Summers right now. I don't know if he's making it through this arc. I don't know if we'll be seeing Saint Summers in the final war. I think this could be it for him. However, I am not Saint Summers, and I'm still quite worried here, to be honest, and it's because everything seems to be going a little bit too well at the moment. At this rate, we don't even need Luffy or Loki. And because this is a story, that's just not going to work. So I want to say brace yourselves, because things are going to get bad. We're at the point where we need another escalation of stakes, because Oda has done a good job of almost completely defusing the bomb that was the abduction of the children. Gunko's arrows are released, and with the kids, they're going all wibbly wobbly. There's also no ship to put the kids on, even if the arrows were still properly active. Killingham's nightmares, they're being fairly easily beaten. And all that stands at the moment between these kids and freedom is the very punchable face of Saint Summers. So I'm not sure if we even know what the ultimate stakes of Elbaph are just yet, and if those stakes will take us all the way to the astral realm for the actual conclusion. All I know is that this chapter leaves me feeling far too confident, and that usually heralds a new sinister twist to plunge us all the way back down to despair. But you let me know what your thoughts on the chapter are in the comments below. Aside from Wano and Sabari, I cannot think of an arc that Brook was in that he was not a contender for the most underrated MVP. I would say that even on Wano, Brook was pretty useful, much more useful than Usopp anyway. But Brook does always tend to be able to surprise us in the most amazing and useful of ways. And something I found rather surprising is that the topic of bounty inflation came up in a space that was not this channel. I, for one, love talking about fictional inflation, as does Nico Robin, as she even mentioned it in relation to the bounties of Dory and Broggy being raised so significantly. So elsewhere on the internet, this idea, it was applied to Brook, right? His original bounty was 33 million berries. Sounds low, very low. But it was calculated that following the same inflation path that Dory and Broggy received, then Brook's bounty back then would actually be worth 594 million berries in the modern day. And if this is true, which it really may not be, but if it is, then when Luffy recruited Brook during Thriller Bark, he was actually far and away the most valuable straw hat, almost doubling Luffy's post any slobby bounty. So yeah, look, maybe there's a good reason why Luffy's messing around with his man crush in the underworld, and we are leaving Brook to 1v1 God. My question is, why does Gunko say daddy and is holding what looks like Brook's hand? So she's saying and doing that because she both says and does those things. But I understand that these two panels were purposely juxtaposed to mislead us, to present the idea that Brook could have been Gunko's father, because Oda employs all sorts of fun narrative tactics to make sure that things always surprise us. So this panel is of Gunko and Brook, although I would now question it somewhat because Brook is only 10 years older than Gunko. So while originally this panel looked to me like a fully adult man would say a toddler, in reality it's probably more like a 5-year-old and a 15-year-old. And Brook and Gunko probably did have quite a strong relationship until the incident occurred, because she was the daughter of a man who Brook held the most paramount of respect for. And then this panel is of a much older Gunko, likely on the day that her father died and or was killed by her, maybe. And it is a bit sketchy, but I have seen a few people speculate that Gunko is wearing her Holy Knight attire in this image, because you can see the epaulets from what may be her God Valley outfit. So what we're looking at here may be the king, Gunko, or Shuri's father, having willingly enlisted his daughter in the Holy Knights. But I don't know, it's all a bit vague right now. Oda, he's playing screwy things with our minds. Considering how things ended up for Saturn, rip Summers. I do very much think that we could see the death of Saint Summers by the end of Elbaph for sure. And my reasoning for this is because, well, we kinda don't need to see any more of him. He's been extremely present and fairly well explored throughout this arc, and I despise him of course, but he has been a pretty great villain, and Oda very rarely serves up the same dish twice. Although one example I could think of is Jack being the main antagonist of Zou and then being regurgitated to us on Wano. So Summers could make it out of this, but we don't need more of Summers after this arc. I don't feel like he's hiding any sort of tragic past to explore, nor do I think he's redeemable for comic value like most minorish One Piece villains. And there's already so many characters in the final war that Summers would just clog things up, and it looks to me like Oda is setting up his exit by having Summers be the person to ruin the plan with the children. It's not that he was defeated, overcome, or outsmarted in any way, it is entirely his fault. And if Elbaph doesn't end well for Imu, then he'll be looking for someone to blame. And Summers, he's the perfect guy. Plus, it might also free up a rank in the Holy Knights for a new character to form a covenant with Imu, who we could then explore in the final war, rather than replaying the greatest hits of Saint Summers. But it also might not be Imu that gets rid of him. Summers could be used as our modern example of how to kill a Holy Knight. I think killing him will use his devil fruit to conjure up a new ship to still kidnap the kids. You see, that is actually a fantastic idea. And I think that under most circumstances, it would work. But this is a different circumstance, because Saint Summers, he will find a way to screw this up. And it has to be Summers, because who else is going to let killing him go into their dreams? Is Imu going to fall asleep and potentially risk Gunko being able to take over her own body again? And the bigger problem is still that all three of them are split up. They've gotten way too arrogant and they've spread themselves way too thin, thinking that all of this was done and dusted. So if Imu, Summers, and Killian were to reunite, then I think that would be problematic, but they're isolated, and not only that, they isolated themselves. So at the moment, the only ship of dreams currently on Elbaph would be the Thousand Sunny. Man on the internet, I challenge you to a game of scissors, paper, rock. 3, 2, 1, go! I chose rock. Did I win? No. Man on the internet, did you notice Oda's artistic choice in that sus panel? He's showing the wings starting to burn away since Gunko is fighting Imu's control. But when Imu takes over again fully, the wings heal. I just thought that was a cool detail by Oda. So a few things here, the first of which is, yes, speaking of artistic choices, I did notice that Oda chose to position the manga camera lens right up Gunko's butt in this shot, and what you are seeing here are the fruits of Oda's training during Egghead Island. He stated that his side quest for that arc was to learn how to draw erotic butts, and evidently that is a skill that he will be taking with us all the way through to the end of the series. But this observation is a very good one. It's tricky to see because you need to, tear your eyes away from the obvious, how shall we say, focal point that Oda has created here. But in this panel, Imunko's wings are tearing almost like fabric, and I think that makes sense because I'm pretty sure that Imu's wings are fashioned out of Gunko's cloak. When we first see Imu taking command, Gunko's hair gets longer and she still has the cloak, but I do think it turns into wings because the cloak disappears when they appear. However, Imunko is still wearing the neck portion of the cloak. Gunko's real name can be read as Sherry, right? So we now have Princess Man Sherry and Princess Manmaya Sherry. So they are very similar, but there are just a couple of important linguistic differences. Princess Mancheri of the Tontara tribe is spelled Shieri, with this little eye-looking character, and there's an extension after the final re character to hold on that sound for a bit. Whereas Gunko's name is spelled a bit more simply, it's just Shiuri. So Shieri and Shiuri. I love the small detail that one of the kids is a lot more terrified of the nightmare Nika than the other kids. Yeah, I completely missed this the first time that I went through the chapter, and not all of the kids do believe that Nika is the god of destruction. Some of them believe that Loki is. And they all have their fears, like Fenrir's and mothers, etc. But I do have one small nitpick about this detail, which is that this is the wrong kid to choose for this. In the panel where the nightmare Nika stabs his sword into the ground, you can see one of the kids shitting himself significantly more than the others, with the implication being that this kid is the one whose worst fear is Nika. But this is actually Bent, and his worst fear is his own mother. He's the reason why we have the mother MMA causing all sorts of assorted chaoses, whereas the kid who conjured Nika is actually Skaldi, who is closer to the front of the line. So it does seem like a small, meticulous detail, but in reality, it's just Bent being extra afraid of everything, including his own mother. As Tekking pointed out, the arrows are still pointed to the ship, which is now falling from the tree. Yeah, look, Tekking, he's a very clever man, and unfortunately, I do think this is correct. Because despite Gunko temporarily breaking free from Imu's control and using that time to release the straw hats, the arrow guiding the children, it is still active. It went all wibbly-wobbly for a second, but it is still there. And if the ship has fallen off branch number 8, then theoretically, the arrow is now guiding the children off the branch as well to fall to their deaths, which was the original threat that was being made in order to set the library and the school on fire. So we do still have a pretty big problem to solve, and at the very least, we need Saint Summers dealt with immediately. Once he's gone, at least we're able to physically stop the kids without getting cut to pieces by thorns. But I don't know if this problem can be solved completely without banishing Imu from Gunko and having her releasing the ability entirely. That one giant next to Ripley looked almost exactly like Ginny. Dang, I miss her. So this would be the giantess in question, and mate, yes, she looks far too much like Ginny. Oda seems to be a big fan of using this particular hairstyle lately, which also translated into Atlas, one of Vegapunk's satellites. And the thinking there was that Vegapunk had made Atlas in honor of Ginny because Vegapunk saw Kuma's memories and how important Ginny was to him. But in light of recent giant-based events, maybe Oda just currently has a bias towards that hairstyle. Why would Imu possess a princess and make her into his own personal vassal? Look, I don't know. Why would Imu be interested in the body of a blue-haired princess? And I wonder if it may have anything to do with his millennia-long obsession with a particular brand of blue-haired princesses. Just gonna put it out there. Imu, he seems to have a type. But Gunko being a princess does open up some other interesting options. Because with that royal lineage, she may actually have some connection to the world nobles by blood. Her kingdom may have been previously ruled by the Manmayers, and they went off to go and live at Marijois, with another family line taking over on the lower realm, just as with the Don Quixotes and the Rikus of Dressrosa. But perhaps not all of the man-mayors were accounted for, and through various passionate physical acts, some genetic material got passed all the way down to Gunko. I don't know though. In the end, Imu is a bit of a weird dude. All I know is that if I had the choice of a body to possess, I would choose the young woman over the obese old prune that was Saint Saturn. Notice how in the one panel it is called Usopp's group. Oda usually does this for the main lead of that group. Gives me hope for Usopp being named over ex-warlord Bombay as the group leader. So the reason why Bombay isn't the leader of the group is because Oda usually does things in order of crew seniority. And this goes to Luffy's language a lot. For example, one way to pluralize things in Japanese is to add the suffix tachi. And when referring to the crew, Luffy often says something like Zoro Tachi, meaning Zoro and the others. But if Zoro was with Luffy, then he would refer to the crew with the next most senior figure, generally in the order in which they joined. Although there is an exception for Sanji because he is a wing of the Pirate King and a natural third in command. And Oda follows this as well, generally, not always. But in this group, Usopp holds the most seniority because sure, Nami is there, but she officially joined after he did. And so I wouldn't necessarily take this as a sign of some sort of Usopp leadership moment, especially because everyone else is actually trying to think and be helpful, while he's just there using the force in the background. Come on, Usopp, we need you, mate. It's your time. Did everyone forget Shamrock? I certainly have not forgotten Shamrock, but Shamrock, he's gone and forgotten us. Dude got summoned back to the Holy Land to deal with all of the chaos happening there. And just consider this for a second. Imu was so desperate to solve this problem that he needed to call Shamrock back. However, Imu himself has remained on Elbaph, or at least his consciousness has. So is Imu not actually powerful enough to stop what's happening at the Holy Land? I guess one explanation for this might be that Imu can't act freely in Marijois, because it would reveal his form to the otherworld nobles who probably know nothing about him. And so he may need the Holy Knights to directly fix whatever's happening here while he's free to do whatever on Elbaph. I just find it funny that there's this problem that not even God can solve, and so we need to call Shamrock back. And either way, I don't know if Shamrock is coming back into focus during this arc. He was there to tease us with his Shanksian features, and I suppose we'll figure him out during the final war. I think Oda is setting the seeds for honestly quite the sad end for Gunko / Shuri. The fact that Brook mentioned she should be near 80 by now. I can see Imu taking away her contract, and right when she starts aging rapidly, takes her out just enough to give some parting words to Brook like he freed her. That is incredibly depressing, but also very possible, very Dorian Gray style. In fact, that may be what happened to Saint Saturn. We knew that he was at least 200 years old when Imu revoked his elder contract, so what we saw there could very well have been Saturn's age catching up with him and turning him into the older man dust that he should have been by that point. But Saturn, he'd been alive for centuries, so Gunko suddenly having the body of an 80-year-old, that doesn't necessarily mean that she would die. Unless Princess Shuri had some sort of illness or condition that meant she would die before reaching a certain age, and maybe that has something to do with why a contract was formed in the first place, and in that case suddenly aging would be significantly more deadly. But we have recently done the illness and even the age shenaniganry with Jewelry Bonnie, so I hope that whatever's going on with Gunko does take us in a different direction. But something I have been thinking about ever since reading this chapter is actually Laboon. For one thing, I heard someone suggest that Gunko's father's name could be Laboon, which would be quite sweet and funny, and that Brook named the whale after this man that he admired so much, because it does look like we're about to enter a very Laboonless aspect of Brook's history, and it's just now starting to make sense. The whole idea that Brook has not gone back to see Laboon yet, which is objectively the easiest dream to accomplish of any of the Straw Hats. Chopper wants to cure all disease, Brook wants to see a whale. These dreams are not the same. However, this is the wonderful threads of fate weaving a goal that Brook didn't even realize he had. There was unfinished business waiting for Brook elsewhere in the world, and if he'd just gone back to Laboon and considered that his legacy done right there and then we wouldn't be tackling the deeper mystery of his past right now, something that he had no interest in revisiting. But this also opens up the possibility that we are going to get to see how Brook Brook got his devil fruit. We never found out how, when, why, or all of the other question words. It's just that by the time that the Rumbar pirates were all tragically dying, they already knew what devil fruit Brook had and how it functioned. Not that this is too unusual. I mean, we never found out when Robin ate her devil fruit either. Sometime between the ages of 2 and 8, I guess. She just suddenly had it one day and then kids threw rocks at her. Although my personal headcanon for that is that Oda didn't show us this because it would have been too depressing. Like a smile fruit situation on Wano, where Robin was so hungry and on the verge of starvation because her aunt wasn't feeding her properly, and so Robin desperately ate anything she could find, and one of those anythings just so happened to be a devil fruit. But I do hope that Brook's case was a bit more intentional, since he seemed to understand exactly how his fruit functioned, and he understood it before he died and was actually able to make use of it. And at the very least, giving Brook a second life does also seem to have fated him to walk alongside the perpetually youthful Gunko, and in a very tragicsome way, Brook could be the lingering remains of the will of Princess Shuri's father. A will that he has to bring to fruition on Elbaph before he's free to pursue his own dream of going back to Laboon. But you let me know what you think of all of this in the comments below. Loki's devil fruit has been revealed. Luffy is fulfilling an Elbaphian prophecy. Saint Summers has more problems, many of them within his own mind. And did you notice something strange about this panel? Because there is something here that will change how you see the ending of this chapter. Big stuff here, starting right from the cover page actually. I'm really loving this cover page with Roger and the T-Rex wearing his hat, and as always I should point out that these cover requests are not canon pieces of art, but at the same time this might be a great opportunity to remember that the Roger Pirates have actually been to Little Garden, which Scopogaban confirmed in chapter 1152. And the island on this cover page, I don't know mate, looks pretty exactly like Little Garden. So I'm not saying that this is exactly what happened, but Roger was there, and it would be a very Will of D sort of thing to do to make friends with a T-Rex. To begin properly though, this is a very, very St. Summers heavy chapter, and it's because it shows the complete dismantleization of his philosophy on love. Summers gets very deranged in this chapter, like full tongue extension and everything, and that's because what's happening now is accidentally a large-scale version of what he did on God Valley. During the native hunting contest, Summers was kicking a child in a tree down to some thorns he'd placed below, and what Summers was really hoping was that that child's parents would throw themselves onto the spikes and impale themselves, destroy their own body to save the child, which is exactly what happened, and it made St. Summers very happy, because he was exploiting love, this emotion that he doesn't understand and sees as a weakness for his own entertainment, and he accidentally set up the very same thing here by destroying the ship. So we now have a whole series of children falling from a big old tree with their big old parents prepared to sacrifice themselves on his thorns to save them. And that's why Summers looks like he's perpetually ejaculating in every panel of this chapter, because this whole situation is just one big wet dream for him. However, it's about to become more of a wet nightmare for Summers, if such a thing does exist, and if it doesn't, well, it does now. But let's be real here, I can see this being quite a contentious chapter, because the vast majority of it does focus on the Elbaph children. And every time they come up, I do hear this lovely chorus of discontent harmonizing a very familiar tune. And I'm not going to say that you're wrong for thinking that. Look, you can use your brain however you see fit. However, for me, I really loved this chapter even before the outrageously amazing ending, because these kids are the heart and soul of the arc. And with each new arc, readers and watchers are given a choice to either invest in that heart or not. During Wano, for example, the heart and soul of that arc was Odin's vassals and the other assorted citizens of Wano. So your enjoyment of Wano in most cases can be directly correlated to how open you were to empathizing with them and following them as if they were the main characters of One Piece. Because during Kingdom arcs, the Straw Hats almost always take on the role of becoming facilitators of those those stories. And it's the same thing here with the kids and the parents. Elbaph, it is their story. It's not about the Straw Hats, not really. And so if you do take that leap and invest in them, then chapters like this, then they pay off pretty well. Having said that though, I'm not going to go through each and every one of the kids and their parents one by one. That would just take too long, and look, we've got dragons to talk about. So just quickly, there are a few key highlights that we do need to address. Some very interesting things here. Firstly, my favorite panel of this entire chapter, yes, even more so than that ending, was this one of Ripley embracing her son Colin. It's such a perfect metaphorical, although in this case quite literal, depiction of parenthood, with Ripley willingly and lovingly enduring all of this pain and suffering for the well-being of her child. And it's the close-up of her face that really gets me, because you can see that there's suffering there, there's like blood happening, but it's like the pain is being drowned out by the overwhelming love being felt here. And what makes this so much more powerful is that just earlier on in the chapter, we are shown Oimo trying to grab one of the kids. And if you don't remember Oimo, he's one of the two former Enislobby guards. And the reason why Oda showed this was to display the kind of power that the parents are up against. The Thorns of Summers wrecked someone of Oimo's caliber, and mate, he is not a weak man. He was one of the giant warrior pirates, and even he's getting cut to pieces by this, which makes this moment of seeing Ripley embrace Colin that much more powersome, because we've already had the calibration for the kind of pain she is now enduring for Colin. It's a lot. It's really a lot. Not just a couple of pricks and pokes here and there. It is enough to bring down a fully fledged giant warrior. However, it is not enough to bring down the power of love, and nothing, I say, that St. Summers could ever conjure would be enough. And for anyone watching this in the future, this chapter was officially released on Monday, February 16th. And I know that this was almost certainly not planned, but I do think that it's quite serendipitous that this chapter was released so close to Valentine's Day. Valentine's Day is generally known as a celebration of romantic love. However, that is not true for all countries. There are many nations in the world where Valentine's Day is a celebration of love in general, which of course extends to friends and family. In fact, I saw a statistic on the internet about this. Even in the United States of America, according to the US Greeting Card Association, half of all Valentine's greetings sent every year are to family members. And among that group, the highest proportion of greetings are sent from parents to children. So again, I don't think this was planned, but it is extremely appropriate for the ultimate expression of parental love in the world of fictional pirates, for that to just so happen to be released around Valentine's Day. It's nice. And with Ripley and Colin, it also needs to be pointed out that we have a flashback panel of the two of them. And in this panel, Colin is playing with a toy that looks suspiciously like the Iron Giant Emmet, which is a toy that I have to imagine is based on the Elbaph mural, where Emmet does appear as one of the allies of the Sun God. Very nice little detail there, and one that you could easily miss if you were just blasting through the pages. And something else I love is that Ripley had a very similar situation when she picked up Frankie earlier on in the arc. In that panel, Frankie looks a lot like a toy Emmet as well. And in a scenario where Killingham's Devil Fruit can be used in our favor to, say, bring our dreams to life rather than our nightmares, then that is the sort of situation where I could see Colin dreaming of Emmet and conjuring a vision of him into existence to help us. I don't know if that's what we're seeding here, but Colin having an Emmet toy is far from a throwaway detail. But one of the other interactions that I really loved was with Ange and Joanna. Joanna was that one child who made a point of stating that she doesn't have parents. It was a bit of an odd thing to say at the time, but now we know why. Because Oda's trying to portray a diversity of relationships and make it clear that, look, if you don't have parents, you're still loved. And so Ange, the school teacher, jumped in to sacrifice herself to save Joanna. And this is why in the previous chapter, Oda had Jinbei give us an Ange status update in order to set this moment up. And I do believe that this officially kills any idea that Ange was the traitor. And finally, it was also great to see the road to redemption continue and even reach completion, with Road eagerly wrapping his arms around his little brother Bjorn, and not only tanking the thorns like every other parent and or guardian, but being willing to give his own life to save Bjorn. And look, Road, he did some weird stuff earlier on in this arc, and he will do more weird stuff in the future, because he's now part of the Nami worship friendship trio along with Sanji and Zeus, so definitely expect more of whatever's going on here. But all is very much forgiven now. He's a good dude at heart. And I was also looking back on some earlier Elbaph chapters, and I feel like I really should have noticed that Bjorn was Rhodes' brother earlier, because when all the kids are commenting on their fates, Bjorn is the only one who's like, well, how about just I be saved? Which is a very Rhodes-like thing to say. However, after this chapter, I do think that Bjorn will have a very different view. There is no doubt in my mind that this will have changed him, and that Bjorn is now going to grow up to be a proud and honorable Elbaphian, all thanks again to the power of love. And also the power of dragons, because all of the children and parents end up falling onto the body of a full Zoan Loki, rising from the underworld, equipped with one rubber man and one squirrel. So obviously it is the last 2 pages of this chapter that have made the biggest impact. And as suspected, Oda was saving the reveal of Loki's devil fruit for a massive moment. And even though I just used that word, I severely underestimated just how massive we were going here, because good God in hell, Loki's dragon Zoan form is unbelievably colossal. And the true scale of this, it is so difficult to grasp at first, and it's all Luffy's fault. So just to emphasize this, the Luffy that we are seeing riding on top of Loki's head is Luffy in his giant form, which is wonderful because it clears another one of our 2026 bingo squares. We finally have giant Luffy in the land of giants, but in comparison to Loki, giant Luffy, he just feels like regular size Luffy. So it's a kind of anticlimactic way to clear that square. But to continue with the scale, remember that giant Luffy was able to use Dragon Kaido as a skipping rope, and Kaido was previously one of the largest creatures we had ever seen. So you just get ready to be blown away mentally by this, because this right here is an estimate of Kaido's size in full dragon form compared to Loki, and doesn't Kaido look cute? Kaido looks more like Momonosuke when Luffy found him on Punk Hazard, the sort of dragon that you could wear as a fashionable scarf. And dragon form Kaido, if you were to measure him from head to tail, is about 900 meters long, so just short of 1 kilometer, or whatever you use in America, which is not that. And look, I don't even know where to begin measuring just how big Loki is in this form. It's truly difficult to comprehend, and of course it's no doubt going to change a lot. We can't just go by this one panel, because Oda is very inconsistent with sizing, so in the future Loki's going to look bigger and smaller and wider and longer and all of that. Now unfortunately what we don't get in this chapter is the name of Loki's devil fruit, but given that it is a dragon, I would say it's almost certainly the Nidhogg fruit, the draconic symbol of destruction and chaos in Norse mythology. And I've already seen some comments pointing out that this dragon, it looks nothing like the silhouette we see in Harold's flashback, and those comments are correct, because this is going to be Loki's hybrid form. What we're seeing now is the full beast mode. So there is another form coming, the form that he used to kill his father, and I think that Loki is gonna look pretty damn incredible. However, with that said, as phenomenal as this is, I do have just one minor complaint, and if you've been watching this channel for a while, this will not surprise you, but me personally, I'm just suffering from a bit of dragon fatigue in One Piece. After 4 years of facing off against not only Kaido on Wano, but also Orochi, who is dragon-esque, and putting Momonosuke in there, who is a copy of Kaido, so all 3 of whom were mythical dragon Zoans, I was honestly hoping never to see a new mythical dragon Zoan again. I was done with them. There are so many other creatures we can explore. Those were my initial thoughts anyway. But then I realized that there were 2 very important weapons in existence to slay my disappointment. The first of which is the importance of dragons in the One Piece world as a whole. Ever since the beginning, they have always been built towards as key creatures of fictional history and mythology, and everyone associated with a dragon, or even the word dragon, carries a large degree of importance in the world, which is also likely why the world nobles chose to call themselves celestial dragons, to adopt that quality for themselves, in the same way that they call themselves saints and gods, when in reality they are the prime sinners and demons. Secondly, and this is much more exciting, Loki appears to be a black dragon that strongly resembles the dragon we see in the Elbaph mural, a dragon which is perched on a tree thought to be Elbaph itself. So the creature that we are meeting here may maybe another god of the One Piece world. Not the sun god that Loki was hoping for, but perhaps the forest god, the one who restored light to the planet after the earth god condemned it to darkness. And if so, we've got this many gods right now. Not just in general, but all in the same location. Luffy, Loki, and Emu, sun, forest, and sea gods. So Elbaph is looking more and more like that mural each and every chapter that passes. And at the moment, all we're missing is the Serpent of Hellfire, which is theorized to be the Red Line itself, a serpent that wrapped itself around the planet Blue Star. So with that in mind, you're damn right that I'm going to get excited about, admittedly, another dragon. However, with all of the dragonness happening, you may have missed something particularly important. I know that I did on the first read-through, because the end of this chapter, it did make me feel like I was going just a little bit insane. And again, this is all Luffy's fault. Because at first I thought that final page with Luffy riding Loki was one of those AI generated pages that people are doing these days. Because Luffy's here and he's doing the very basic Gear 5th pose. And he's also not in his Elbaph outfit. Whereas previously when he entered Gear 5th on this island, he had a very cool and unique thematic design to go along with it. That's not a big deal. I would personally prefer to see the Elbaph Gear 5th design because I like it quite a bit, but whatever makes our captain feel the most free. Who am I to tell Luffy how to dress? But the weirder thing, and this might be an error, or it might not be, because it's either an error or something absolutely wild is happening. But on the previous page, right before our big reveal, you can see that Luffy isn't wearing his shirt, which initially felt to me like a continuity error, particularly because these inconsistencies have become pretty common in the Elbaph era. However, there is a chance that it may be on purpose, because Luffy here doesn't look like Luffy, not at all actually, and in fact, he looks a hell of a lot like Nika. As so far, the sun god Nika has always been shown to us with hair covering his eyes and as a scandalously shirtless being. And even the nightmare version of Nika conforms to this. So I do think there is a chance that this is not an error, that Oda did not forget to draw Luffy's shirt, because this was drawn this way on purpose to present Luffy as the sun god Nika from the perspective of the children, because this is exactly what we said would happen. Oda chose to use the Nightmare Nika as the main threat in the last chapter so that he could be directly compared to the real deal once Luffy arrived. And so my explanation for this panel would be that what we're seeing is from the perspective of the children. They're getting this flash of Luffy and their minds are quickly telling them that this is the sun god Nika before they get a clearer view of him on the next page. That is my logic anyway, especially with Jarl's quote about the sun god descending with the drums of liberation on a day with lightning and snowstorms, accompanied by a gigantic beast. It feels very, very designed. And look, I'd also be happy to accept if this was an error. We will find out in the volume release if so. But the more I think about it, the more I feel like presenting Luffy in this way was very purposeful. And to bring this up again, I also suspect this may be the beginning of what turned St. Killingham's powers against Emu and the Holy Knights, because the kids are now seeing not only Nika, but also what is likely the Nidhogg, and by extension Loki, and all of them are now being seen as heroic beings. So for the kids whose worst fears were Nika, Loki, and the Nidhogg, they should no longer be viewing them that way. And if they keep spawning, then they could now start spawning good versions. And not only that, but even more powerful versions, because what the kids are seeing here, and it's hard to say this with a cartoon riding a dragon, but what they're seeing here is reality, which completely dwarfs their imaginations. The nightmare creatures are extremely flimsy in comparison to the true forms of Luffy, Loki, and the Nidhogg. And you know what? Even Brook has a good chance of getting in here. He might appear to save one of the kids at some point, with them mistaking him for a Draugr, and thus turning all of the Draugrs into dream brooks, which would send Gunko wild. Endless brooks just spawning all around her. Yo! But I will say that I did not anticipate Luffy and Loki arriving as quickly as they have, and that may signal that Elbaph has a lot less time left in it than I originally thought, because what we are seeing here, it is very arc climax stuff, like when Luffy rode Momonosuke back into battle against Kaido. Once Luffy did that, we knew that this was ending right then and there. However, in this case, we haven't even had round 1 against Emu yet. In fact, we don't have any Emu in this chapter at all. To be fair, he's probably got his hands full dealing with Soul God Brook at the moment, but I cannot wait to see Emu's reaction to both Luffy and Loki, especially the latter, because it may be Emu who confirms whether or not this dragon is the one that was depicted on the Elbaph mural. So we have got some incredible chapters ahead, but you let me know what you thought of this one in the comments below. Loki just took Kaido's title as the world's strongest creature. Alright, so I find this very hard to argue with, and I think Kaido does as well because he still has yet to emerge from his lovely and potentially fatal magma bath. But even if Kaido was still alive, honestly, Loki versus Kaido, what do you think? Who would win? Because I'm having a very hard time making the case for Kaido in my mind right now. And that might just be because I'm still so blown away by the sheer scale of Loki in his dragon form. But the title of this chapter is the strongest in the world, and not just creature either, it's just flat out strongest in the world. Although I have to say, I don't think that it refers to Loki. And before I say the thing it is I do think, I should mention that I've also seen ideas that it could be referencing Luffy and or Nika, because something that I did not mention in the review video is that when the glorious drums of liberation begin, all of Elbaph appears to be dancing. So Luffy's abilities are affecting the entire island, or at the very least what we can see of it, which has happened before. Luffy did a similar thing by making all of the buildings on Egghead Island do a bit of a dance. So it is no longer out of the question to be having these top 1 discussions with Luffy as an actual candidate. However, my heart tells me that the title likely either does not refer to Luffy or Loki, and what Oda is alluding to is that love is the strongest in the world. Because apart from the last couple of pages, this whole chapter is about the extraordinary power of love, which I will point out is the power that Rox mentioned to Loki. He said that Harold didn't join him because of love. And as a child to Loki, that may have sounded like a cop-out. But now what we're seeing before us, it's quite the power. And it's the power that Ida used to save Loki after such a horrendous start to life. And in effect, Ida saved the entire world due to Loki going on to become a fine young man when he very easily could have become one of our greatest enemies if Ida had not stepped in. Which is something that's been seeded in One Piece since the pre-time skip era with Garp's famous Fist of Love, and Oda confirming in an SBS that Garp did not use Haki to hurt Luffy, he used love. So love is more powerful than Haki, or at the very least it can be used in a similar way. But in conclusion, the strongest in the world is something love probably, which puts Sanji in a very curious position. As of all of the Straw Hats, he is the one best positioned to take advantage of this untapped power system. Moving briefly back to Kaido though, Jarl's quote at the end of the chapter has some fascinating retrospective implications. The whole sun god arriving with this gigantic beast blotting out the sky sort of thing, because Kaido, he himself had a sort of thing with the concept of Joy Boy, which we didn't dive into as deeply as I would have liked. But oddly enough, if Kaido had any idea about this prophecy, which is not out of the question, we don't know how much Rox told him and the rest of the Rox pirates, but if Kaido knew something along these lines, then he could have at one point assumed that he was the beast in question. Before we knew about Loki, so last week, there was no one better suited for that role. And so Kaido, he remained on Wano, which Joy Boy was also prophesied to open up, bring down the borders, etc. And Kaido waited for Joy Boy to eventually arrive, which he did, and the sun god did indeed rise. And it's something that even Vegapunk could have bought into because he was a sun god believer, or at least sun god curious, and Vegapunk initially chose Kaido's devil fruit as the target of his cloning fruit experiment, a fruit which ended up in the belly of Momonosuke. But if Vegapunk was looking at the ancient history and perhaps trying to engineer the return of the sun god, then that could be why that fruit was his obsession, and why he was so upset that it was a failure beyond the hilarious color joke. Loki can join the crew. Just put the Sunny and crew on Loki's head, and now they can fly wherever. They can also infiltrate the Holy Land by orbital dropping from above. So this does open up a whole new world for the Straw Hats. Even if Loki doesn't, actually join the crew and he's more of a long-term ally, it's still good, because it's like unlocking late-game fast travel in an RPG. You spend such a long time painstakingly just walking to new locations. But then at a certain point you get this power and you can essentially just warp back to wherever you want. But man on the internet, why would Luffy even need such a thing? Well, we are now reaching the point of One Piece where we are running out of new locations to visit, and we need to start thinking about all of the islands that we need to go back to for whatever reason, such as Wano, which has the ancient weapon Pluton, such as Punk Hazard, which has the frozen Galila giants, and such as Fishman Island, which has an actual prophecy depicting Luffy's return. And there's more, so many more other places that have these unfinished plot lines, and it may be that these get taken care of individually by other factions, but if we did need a way to handle this ourselves, then Loki is by far the best option I have seen to date. The question in my mind, however, is whether or not Luffy would accept that. He's a pirate at heart, and piracy, it is all about being free to sail on the endless seas. And the Thousand Sunny wouldn't be much of a ship of dreams if it never had to sail on its own from here on out. And that also wouldn't satisfy Frankie, because his dream is for the Sunny to circumnavigate the globe. And traveling via dragon is probably considered cheating. But with that said, maybe just one journey. I'm sure that Luffy wouldn't object to a singular dragon flight. Loki's so big, he's about to have a log pose lock onto him. So I don't know if this is meant as a joke, but it is, I think, actually possible, because that is exactly what happened with Zunesha. Zunesha is considered to be a phantom island, and if he were to stand still, I'm not sure if he could be locked onto with a regular log pose, but the residents of Zou have been able to construct eternal poses that lead them straight to Zou. Although that might be because Zunesha actually does have a whole island on its back. But this is another point, maybe in favor of Loki joining the Straw Hats, because Zunesha was part of Joy Boy's crew, and if we are looking to fatesomely recreate that dynamic, then Luffy may need his own island-sized creature by his side. Shamrock was really lucky he fought a restrained Loki. Yeah, mate. Shamrock had no idea what he was getting himself into. And it's not just about the dragon part either. When we saw Shamrock taking a bit of a verbal piss all over Loki, we did not know at the time that Loki is the only known person in this world who has managed to kill someone powered by a Depths Covenant, such as Shamrock. And so his life, and indeed the life of every Holy Knight, is in very real danger when it is stacked up against Loki. Although the flip side of this discussion is just how powerful was Shanks, because he was able to actually stop Loki. During the Harold incident, Shanks was acting more like a glorified doorstop, whereas Loki was the only one who had the power to actually take on Harold. So what happened in the years after this? How much stronger did Shanks become from that moment? Or alternatively, is there a bit more to this story that we still don't understand yet? Could it be that Loki and Shanks made a bit of a deal, and that this is one final lie yet to be revealed to us? That Shanks did not defeat Loki, but instead Loki begged Shanks to lie and say that he did for the sake of, I don't know, something peace on Elbaph. Earlier I said I was having a hard time seeing how Kaido beats Loki, and to be honest, I've got the same issue with Shanks. If Shanks really did beat Loki, then even the shiniest of Shanks' glazers have severely underestimated just how powerful he really is. It's still messing with my brain reading Oimo get called Grandpa. Yeah, that messed with my head as well. As it turns out, Oimo is the grandparent of Olav, and there was quite a sad short story in this chapter where Olav actually hated Oimo for having been one of the giant warrior pirates, and the implication that comes with that is that violence and savagery, etc., not good. But also, in Olav's defense, just remember that he really doesn't know his grandfather Oimo all that much. They have a very estranged relationship because Oimo and Kashi have only been back on Elbaph for about 2 years. Prior to that, they were guards on Eni Slobby for 50 years because the world government lied to them about Dory and Brogy. And Olav, he's probably in his 20s about now, so he spent almost 2 decades not knowing his grandfather. Meanwhile, Oimo was at Eni Slobby, and you know what? After learning about what happened with Harold, I'm very surprised that Imu would approve the plan to trick 2 giants into serving them. He was very vitriolic about the whole Elbaph is the D business. Oh wait, actually, no, I've gotten this wrong. Oimo and Kashi were already serving Eni Slobby for decades by the time that the Harold situation happened. So scratch that complaint, although I'm still surprised that Emu allowed it to continue post-Harold, because without Oimo and Kashi, the Eni Slobby arc would have been a disaster for not the world government, for us, as these 2 giants were an integral element in bringing down the Judicial Island. Again, Elbaph is the D. But Oimo, however, is 153 years old, so he was 101 when he started the Enislobby contract. Well and truly old enough to have had a son or daughter by then, as it seems like the standard age for giants to start spawning new giantlets is around the 60s. Loki just saw the type of parental love that he only felt when he lost Ida and Harold. So it's actually a bit more than that. There is a very underrated and very painful thing happening here. As a child, Loki was thrown off a cliff from the Sun World into the Underworld by his mother in an attempt to get rid of his life, to remove it because of Estrid's hatred and disgust of her own son. Meanwhile, in this chapter, we have the opposite. We have a legion of parents and guardians ready to throw themselves off that very same jump because of the love that they have for their children. So everything happening here is a reverse Loki scenario, and it gives us a lot of hope for the future of Elbaph because its residents are all, whether they realize it or not, following the path that Harold and Ida dreamed of building together. And this is very good news because things could have gone very differently, with Elbaph becoming a more savage and cruel society should Emu have gotten his way. You can hate on American measurements, but guess what? Loki is a Western dragon, not Eastern like Kaido. So you're right about the dragons, definitely. Although I'm unaware of the American legends of dragons. Feels like more of a European thing to me. But also, guess what? The West uses the metric system, as does the North, South, and East. All of this blue right here, glorious metric system users. It's just this purple over here and this weird orange over there that's essentially holding us back from achieving world peace. Meters and kilometers, get it together, guys. I think the Emmet toy is a creation of Walpole's Devil Fruit. So this is in reference to the toy that Colin won in an alleged duel. And I have been seeing comparisons to Walpole, which is going to be very confusing if you're not familiar with Walpole's cover story. In Walpole's Omnivorous Hurrah, Walpole becomes so destitute that he starts to eat garbage and then uses his Devil Fruit ability to create toys to sell to children to make a living. But then he accidentally invents a revolutionary metal substance, is given all of the money, and he has since used that to buy himself an entire country. This dude has world noble level cash money now. But people on the internet have been drawing comparisons to his toys, one of which looks, I don't know, kind of like Emmet, but not really. If you can't tell, I'm not entirely sold on this, but to be fair, Wappo metal has made its way all around the world. In fact, the very last chapter of Wappo's cover story stated that it had spread to, quote, all corners of the world, and Frankie Shogun is even made out of Wappo metal. But in this case, I don't buy it though, because this Emmet toy would be several times larger than Wappo himself, and there's also no way that Wappo accidentally makes a toy that looks exactly like Emmet, so I think this has to be something that was made on Elbaph in reference to the mural. Or you know what, maybe even a little robot prototype that someone found in that 3,000-year-old lab that we still haven't explored. Maybe it's not a toy at all. I'm surprised you didn't mention Loki's eyes in this chapter. Yes, a lot of people were, because one of our 2026 bingo squares was Loki blindfold removed. And in this chapter, his eyes are no longer blindfolded, so why didn't I not tick off of the square? I'm not counting it towards the bingo just yet, because I don't think it's in the spirit of the square. In his dragon form, people would expect the kind of scary eyes that he naturally has, although we don't even see them here. Loki's eyes in dragon form have this Domi Reversey style eye effect. But the point of the square was for Loki to show his eyes in his human form, to reveal himself, to become himself. Kind of like when Katakuri finally removed the scarf that covered his eel mouth. To have that moment of not hiding anymore. So as much as Loki's eyes are technically on display in this chapter, I don't think we've quite achieved the spirit of removing the blindfold just yet, because Loki is still hiding in his dragon form. Why is there no sound? How many flying fruits do we have now, Mr. Man on the internet? Well, I am so glad that you asked that question. It's a very important question. As we all know, in chapter 169, page 17, panel number this one, Pell appeared in his falcon form and he famously said, "You're lucky to see this. Only 5 flying devil fruits are known to exist." And so every time a new flying fruit comes into the story, I see it as my personal duty to point this out, to count how many we're up to and just to see if we found all 5 by now. So let's do the customary count. Firstly, there's Pell. He was the first. He said it. We've also already mentioned Kaido in this video, but I want to make it clear that we won't count Momonosuke because he was just copying Kaido's homework, but we do also have Marco's Phoenix fruit. There is a definite flyboy there. Meanwhile, King's Pteranodon fruit was also rather flysome, plus Doc Q's horse now has a mythical Pegasus fruit, not to be confused with Garnfal's bird Pierre, who ate a horse fruit and became a Pegasus. But there were also 2 insect zoans within the Tontada tribe on Dressrosa, both of whom were flying insects. On Egghead Island, Stussy's bat fruit definitely allows her to fly. Shiki's devil fruit famously allows flight. Buffalo's devil fruit turned him into a full-on plane, and now with Dragon Loki, that makes 5. So that's all 11 5-flying devil fruit users accounted for in One Piece. And that's not even looking at weirder scenarios either. Like Big News Morgans, you'd think that he would be on the list given that he has a bird zone as well, but apparently it does not allow him to fly. While Sasaki, on the other hand, can go on and become a glorious Triceracopter. Plus, almost every Logia user can use their element to fly by propelling themselves from their lower bodies. There's also Batman. Remember Batman? His wings come out of his ass, but the dude can still fly. And this is looking much less likely, but it is still possible that Marcus Mars may have a devil fruit, although it could just be the powers of making an abyssal covenant with Imu. TLDR, there are only 5 flying devil fruits in existence, and nothing you can say will convince me otherwise. You pointed out the removal of fears from Nika and such, so it's worth pointing out that that one kid is no longer scared of his mum. Yes, we have now very satisfactorily wrapped up the mother plot point that started hilariously when the nightmare creatures first appeared. The child in question, his name is Bent, and he is no longer afraid of his own mother, who is absolutely awesome, one of my favorite Elbaph characters now. And this is a very big deal, because it means that this legion of nightmare mothers could now transform into an army of powersome dream mothers. This is very good news because earlier on in the arc, a hit squad of mothers attacked the great Eric and even scared Dory and Broggy to a degree that no other creature in this world is capable of. And now we could have the same situation but flipped. In that case, it was Dory and Broggy versus the nightmare mothers. But now that Dory and Broggy have been Domi-reversi'd, the dream mothers could take on the nightmare Dory and Broggy. And given how terrified they reacted in the initial confrontation, I would love to see this scenario reversed and to have those mothers fighting on our side. How do we know Luffy is in giant form? Also, he has his shirt on in the last panel while he's riding Loki. Yeah, so we talked about the shirt versus no shirt thing in the last video. But this is a wonderful question. How do we know that Luffy is giant? And it's quite easy to miss. But it's because of this panel. This flat white pancake lying on Loki here is actually Luffy. And what appears to be little black specks of seasoning are the literal giants that have just been plonked onto Luffy's belly. Ripley, Oimo, Ange, the others, they're all here. But you can't tell who's who because they are all so small compared to Luffy. So this is a giant Luffy, and again, even the giant Luffy looks so ridiculously tiny compared to Loki. You didn't see one detail. Luffy is in his normal size, not in the gigantic version. Didn't you see that squirrel besides him? So I'm glad someone brought up the squirrel. Someone should always bring up the squirrel. And I would like to bring up that the squirrel is also a giant. Do not be deceived, Ragnar. He may look small and cute, but he has only ever been one of those things. Ragnar in his hammer form is almost as tall as Loki is, and Loki is about 3 times the size of Harridan. So with that in mind, this is what Ragnar looks like on this size chart. So when gazing at this adorable squirrel riding a dragon with Rubber Boy, do not be fooled. Ragnar is beyond massive, and the only way that Luffy even stands a chance of being seen in this image at all is in his giant form. But you let me know if you have more thoughts on anything that you've heard in this video in the comments below.